Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This happened a few years ago, but it still lingers in my mind like it was yesterday. I had taken a job as a seasonal worker for the state's Historical Preservation Society. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid well, and I liked the solitude. My assignment was simple: stay at the abandoned lighthouse on the outskirts of town and document any structural damage. The lighthouse had been decommissioned for decades, left to decay against the relentless sea winds, but the town wanted to restore it as a historical site. I arrived in early September. The lighthouse stood at the edge of a craggy coastline, separated from town by miles of winding roads and dense forest. The building itself was old but sturdy, standing tall against the gray sky. It had a narrow spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room, and beneath it, a small, one-story keeper's quarters where I would be staying. The first few days were uneventful. My routine was simple: wake up early, take notes on the condition of the building, and send daily reports back to my supervisor. I spent my evenings sitting on the porch, staring out at the vast, empty ocean. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed it. No city noise, no distractions, just me, the sea, and the occasional seagull. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed things that felt off. For one, the air around the lighthouse always seemed unnaturally still. Even on the windiest days, when the trees along the cliffside swayed violently, the air inside the lighthouse remained heavy, unmoving. It was subtle at first, something I chalked up to the structure itself blocking the wind. But then there were the sounds, distant, muffled noises echoing from the top of the tower at night. It started as a soft creaking, like old wood settling, but over time, it became something else. Something rhythmic. I told myself it was just the wind, that the structure was old and prone to making noises. But then there was the door. The lighthouse had a main entrance leading to the spiral staircase, but there was also a side door that led directly into the keeper's quarters. The lock was old and rusted, but functional. I always made sure to secure it before going to bed. But one morning, I woke up to find it slightly ajar. At first, I thought I had forgotten to lock it. I even laughed at myself, blaming my forgetfulness on the exhaustion of long work hours. But then it happened again, and again. Each night, I made a conscious effort to bolt the door, double-checking it before going to sleep. And every morning, without fail, I would wake up to find it open just a crack, barely enough to notice, but enough to unsettle me. By the end of the first week, I had started keeping a knife under my pillow. Not because I thought I needed it, but because it gave me some sense of security. If someone was messing with me, I wanted to be ready. But it wasn't just the door. The lighthouse itself seemed to shift in ways I couldn't explain. It'd leave my tools in one place, only to find them moved later. My flashlight, which I always placed on the small table beside my bed, would sometimes be on the floor when I woke up. And then there were the shadows, fleeting, indistinct shapes that seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the stress of being alone was getting to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something wasn't right. And I was about to find out just how wrong I was. The night it truly began, I was sitting on the small wooden porch attached to the keeper's quarters. The air was thick with the scent of salt, and the waves crashed against the rocks below with a steady rhythm. I had just finished my nightly routine, locking the doors, checking my equipment, and making sure my reports were in order. My flashlight rested beside me, casting a weak glow over the weathered floorboards. The sky was unusually dark that night, with thick clouds stretching across the horizon. No moonlight, no stars, just a void of blackness pressing down on the ocean. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, exhaling a slow breath. The lighthouse tower loomed above, its glass windows reflecting the occasional flicker of lightning far off in the distance. And then I heard it. A thud. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A single, dull impact from somewhere inside the lighthouse. I turned my head toward the tower, my pulse quickening. The place was old, settling wood, shifting beams, maybe even birds nesting somewhere in the upper levels. That was the logical explanation. But something about the sound made my skin crawl. It hadn't been random or erratic. It was deliberate. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight. My breath came slow and controlled, but my fingers were tight around the handle. I didn't want to go inside, but I had to. The door to the main entrance was still locked, just as I had left it. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath my boots. The air was heavier than usual, thick with the scent of dust and aged wood. I swept my flashlight across the room, nothing out of place. The desk, the chair, the old filing cabinets, all untouched. But then I heard it again. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from above. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My flashlight beam trembled slightly as I aimed it toward the spiral staircase. The iron steps led up into darkness, curving out of sight. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or an owl that had gotten inside through a broken window. That would explain everything. But that didn't explain the door. The side door leading into the keeper's quarters, the one that had been mysteriously opening each night, was unlocked again. Wide open. I felt a cold wave of unease wash over me. I had locked that door. I knew I had. I stepped closer, my heart pounding against my ribs. The wind outside had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the old wood, but the air inside the lighthouse remained eerily still. Then, something moved at the top of the staircase. A shadow. It was only for a split second, but I saw it, just beyond the curve of the steps. A dark, shifting form, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse. No response. I stepped back, my flashlight beam trembling as I aimed it up the stairs. Nothing but empty air. The shadow was gone. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the flashlight tighter. This was ridiculous. I was letting my mind play tricks on me. Sleep deprivation, isolation, it was a dangerous combination. I needed to get out of there. I turned toward the side door, ready to retreat to the keeper's quarters. But just as I reached for the handle, the temperature in the room dropped. Not a gradual change, an immediate, suffocating cold that wrapped around me like a vice. My breath came out in a cloud of mist, my fingers stiff from the sudden chill. Then, the door slammed shut. Hard! The sound echoed through the lighthouse, shaking the walls. My flashlight flickered violently before cutting out completely, leaving me in pitch darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, from somewhere above me, I heard it. A slow, deliberate footstep on the iron staircase. Something was up there, and it was coming down. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the dark. My ears strained against the silence, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The footstep had been unmistakable, metal against metal, deliberate and slow. My flashlight was useless, the small device flickering one last time before going completely dead in my grip. Another step. The sound carried down the narrow spiral staircase, hollow and heavy. Whoever or whatever was up there was descending. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that lighthouse and never look back, but my body refused to move. My mind, desperate for logic, kept repeating the same thought. It's an animal. It has to be. But deep down, I knew better. A third step. This time, closer. My pulse pounded against my skull, and I forced myself to take a step back. My heel caught the edge of the wooden threshold leading into the keeper's quarters, and the sudden movement snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and yanked the door open, stumbling inside before slamming it shut behind me. For a few agonizing seconds, I stood in the pitch-black room, my back pressed against the door, my fingers clenched so tightly around my useless flashlight that my knuckles ached. I held my breath, listening. Silence! The wind outside howled against the windows, rattling the glass, but inside, the lighthouse was deathly still. I waited. 1 minute, 2, 3. Nothing. I exhaled shakily, my breath still visible in the freezing air. I fumbled along the wall, searching for the small lantern I had brought with me. My hands were trembling so badly that I nearly knocked it over, but after a few desperate tries, I managed to light the wick. A warm, flickering glow filled the small room, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body rigid, my ears tuned to every creak and groan of the old structure. But the footsteps never came closer. Whoever, whatever, had been in the tower had stopped. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow at the top of the stairs, heard the slow, deliberate footsteps, felt the unnatural cold that had wrapped around me like a presence. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it all. Sleep deprivation, stress, the isolation, it was playing tricks on me. There had to be a rational explanation. I spent the entire next day checking every inch of the lighthouse, searching for some logical reason for what had happened. I climbed the spiral staircase, each step groaning under my weight. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have been. I reached the top, stepping into the lantern room where the massive glass windows overlooked the endless expanse of ocean. Everything appeared normal. The old machinery was rusted and covered in dust, untouched for decades. The glass was dirty but intact. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been up here. But then I noticed something. Near the base of the lantern, partially obscured by grime and debris, were footprints. They weren't mine. The dust had settled thick over the floor, undisturbed except for these prints. Bare feet. The imprints were faint but unmistakable. They started near the glass, facing outward toward the ocean, and then turned toward the staircase, as if something had been standing there, watching. A chill crept up my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. Maybe someone from town had been up here before me, though that didn't explain why the footprints seemed fresh while everything else was coated in years of dust. I needed to be sure. That night, I set up a small camera in the main room, facing the staircase. It wasn't high-tech, just a simple motion-activated device I had brought for documentation purposes. If someone or something was moving around at night, it'd have proof. I locked every door, checked the windows, and kept the lantern burning beside my bed. The glow was small but reassuring, keeping the worst of the shadows at bay. I lay in my cot, staring at the ceiling, waiting. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Then I heard it. The camera clicking on. My eyes snapped open, my breath itching in my throat. The room was dark except for the lantern's glow, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then I heard it again. A soft mechanical click. The camera had detected motion. My heart pounded as I sat up, reaching for my flashlight. I turned it on, the weak beam barely cutting through the dimness. I grabbed the camera, my fingers fumbling to access the footage. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy black and white image of the staircase. At first, nothing. Just an empty frame of stillness. Then, movement. A shadow stepped into view, slow and deliberate. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a person. But something was wrong. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long, its posture slightly hunched. The head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it was listening. The face was obscured in darkness, but I could see the vague outline of a mouth, open. Then it turned, not like a person moving normally, more like a flickering motion, too fast, as if the frame had skipped. One moment it was facing the camera, the next it was closer. Too close. I dropped the camera. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled backward. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. Something had been in the lighthouse. Something had seen me. And worst of all, it was getting closer. I don't remember getting up. I don't remember reaching for the door. One moment, I was staring at that horrifying image on the camera, and the next, I was in motion, running. My feet barely touched the cold wooden floor as I stumbled toward the exit, my mind screaming at me to get out. The lantern flickered violently as my hand slammed against the doorknob, twisting it so hard I thought it would snap off. The door groaned as I yanked it open, the icy air outside hitting me like a punch to the chest. But I didn't care. I had to leave. I made it 2 steps outside before I heard it, the creak of the floorboards behind me. Something was in the room. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The weak beam sliced through the dimness, illuminating the doorway. The lantern's glow barely reached beyond the threshold, but in the shifting light, I could see it, a figure standing just inside. Too tall, too still. Its head was tilted, just like in the footage. I couldn't see its face. The shadows swallowed every detail, but I knew it was watching me. Then it moved. Not a step, not a slow approach. A sudden, jarring shift. Like a film skipping forward, one moment in the doorway, the next closer. I staggered backward, nearly losing my footing. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my breathing shallow and ragged. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The air around me grew heavier, suffocating. My ears rang with a dull, hollow sound, like being underwater. Then came the whisper. Not from the figure. Not from inside the lighthouse. From everywhere. It slithered through the air, a voice without sound, an echo without origin. The words were impossible to understand, a garbled, twisting thing that slithered into my ears and coiled around my brain. My knees buckled. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, tumbling into the dirt. The beam flickered wildly, illuminating the lighthouse walls, the broken fence, the darkened windows. And then the footsteps started again, coming toward me. I scrambled backward, my hands digging into the frozen ground. My breath came in sharp gasps, my vision blurring at the edges. The whispering grew louder, clawing at my thoughts. Then, the door slammed shut. The sound shattered the air like a gunshot, echoing across the empty cliffside. The moment it did, everything stopped. The footsteps, the whispering, the crushing weight in my chest. Silence! I sat there in the dirt, my body shaking uncontrollably, my pulse hammering against my skull. My breath fogged in the icy night air as I stared at the lighthouse door, waiting for what I didn't know. Seconds passed, then minutes. Nothing. The lighthouse stood as it always had, tall, silent, and empty. But I knew it wasn't empty. Something was inside. Something had seen me. Something had followed me. I forced myself to my feet, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. My body screamed at me to keep running, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. Not yet. I had to know. With shaking hands, I bent down and grabbed my flashlight. The beam was weaker now, flickering, as if the light itself was afraid. I turned back toward the lighthouse, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. One step forward, then another. The closer I got, the heavier the air became. It felt thick, like walking through water. My breathing grew shallow, my pulse thrumming loudly in my ears. I reached the door. The wood was ice cold. I raised my hand, hesitating. My fingers trembled as they hovered over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, but I needed to know. I needed to see. With one final breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The lantern still flickered weakly on the table. My cot was undisturbed. The air inside was freezing, colder than outside. My breath came out in thick, visible plumes. I stepped inside, my boots creaking against the floorboards. The silence pressed in around me, thick and unnatural. Then I saw it. The footprints, leading from the staircase to where I had been sleeping. I sucked in a sharp breath, my stomach twisting into knots. My flashlight beam followed the path of the prints, my mind racing. They stopped beside the cot, right where my head had been. My skin crawled with a sickening realization. Whatever had been watching me from the stairs the night before had stood over me all night. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. My flashlight wavered, sweeping across the room, and then I saw it. Not in front of me, not near the staircase. In the reflection, the small mirror hanging on the opposite wall, cracked, old, covered in dust. A figure stood in it, tall, unmoving, watching me. But when I turned around, nothing was there. A cold dread settled in my bones. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers ached. Then, in the silence, the whisper returned. I don't remember running. I don't remember grabbing my things. One moment, I was staring at that cracked mirror, at the figure inside it, and the next, I was outside, gasping for air, heart pounding, legs shaking beneath me. The night air was freezing, but it felt nothing like the cold inside that lighthouse. That was something different, something unnatural. I stood there for a long time, my breath coming out in ragged gasps, staring at the lighthouse door. The wind howled across the cliffside, waves crashing violently below, but I barely heard them. My mind was stuck on one thing. It had said my name, not whispered, not muttered, spoken. A shudder ran through me. My body ached with exhaustion, but I couldn't go back inside. Not after that. My bag was still inside, my lantern, my notebook, even my jacket, but none of that mattered anymore. I would leave it all behind if it meant I never had to step foot in that place again. I turned away, forcing my legs to move, forcing myself to leave. I had barely taken 2 steps when I heard it. A single, deliberate footstep from inside the lighthouse. My entire body locked up. The air around me seemed to still, every sound fading into an eerie silence. Another step, and then another, coming closer to the door. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I ran. I tore across the cliffside, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip. My boots slipped on the damp grass, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My breath was ragged, my chest burning with every step. I didn't dare look back. The small, winding path leading away from the lighthouse was barely visible, but I knew where it led. Down the cliffs, toward the docks, toward the boat. The ground sloped sharply downward, my footing unstable. A sharp pain shot up my ankle as I stumbled, nearly collapsing onto the jagged rocks below. But I kept going. The lighthouse light flickered behind me, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. For a split second, I swore I saw something in the light's path, a tall, unmoving figure standing near the edge of the cliff, watching me. I didn't stop. By the time I reached the docks, my body was screaming in pain. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but relief flooded through me when I saw the small boat still tied up. Shaking hands fumbled with the knots. My breath came in ragged gasps, my fingers nearly numb with the cold. The wooden boat creaked as I pushed away from the dock, my flashlight casting eerie reflections on the dark water. I rowed, harder than I ever had before. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its beam cutting through the fog. My muscles screamed in protest, but I didn't slow down. I wouldn't feel safe until I was far, far away. Then, the light flickered. Once. Twice. And then, it went out. I froze. The oars slipped from my hands, the boat rocking gently beneath me. The darkness swallowed everything. And then, in the silence, a whisper. Not from the lighthouse. Not from the cliffs. From the water. I spun, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam cut across the waves, the surface rippling unnaturally. Then I saw it. A reflection. My own face, distorted, twisted. And behind me, a figure, standing in the boat. I don't remember getting back to shore. One moment, I was in that boat, staring at the thing behind me. And the next, I was waking up on the rocky beach, the morning sun barely cutting through the thick fog. My clothes were soaked, my hands scraped raw from the sharp stones beneath me. The lighthouse stood in the distance, silent. Its light was still out. For a long time, I just lay there, staring at it. Had I fallen into the water? Had I hit my head? That would have been the easy answer, the logical one. But I knew better. Something had been in that boat with me. Something had whispered my name. Something had watched me run. And now it was quiet. I forced myself to stand, my body aching with exhaustion. My boat was gone. Maybe the tide had taken it. Maybe it had sunk. Maybe something else had pulled it under. None of that mattered. I needed to leave. I stumbled along the shoreline, heading toward the small town a few miles inland. Every step felt like dragging myself through thick mud, my body fighting against some unseen weight. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the morning had fully settled in. The streets were empty, most people still tucked away in their homes. I found an old fisherman near the docks, his weathered face twisting in concern when he saw me. "Got caught in the tide?" he asked, his voice rough from years of salt air. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I just nodded. He looked me over, his gaze flicking toward the lighthouse in the distance. A knowing expression crossed his face. "You were up there, weren't you?" I hesitated. Then, finally, I nodded again. The old man sighed, shaking his head. "Shouldn't have gone alone." His voice was quiet, almost like a warning. I wanted to ask him what he meant. I wanted to tell him everything. But I didn't, because some part of me already knew. I left that town a few hours later, walking until I found a bus heading toward the city. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't file any reports. I didn't even try to get my things back. I just left, and I never went back. That was years ago. Sometimes I tell myself it was all in my head, that exhaustion and fear had twisted my perception, that the shadows were just tricks of the light, that the voice was just the wind. But then I dream, and in those dreams, am back in that lighthouse. Back in my early 20s, I was fresh out of college and desperate for a stable job. After months of searching, I finally landed a position as a night shift janitor at an old hospital on the outskirts of town. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid well enough, and I figured it would be quiet. Just me, a mop, and a few empty hallways. That's what I thought. This hospital wasn't like the modern, well-lit facilities you see on TV. It was an older building, constructed in the early 1900s, with multiple wings added on over the decades. Some parts had been renovated, but others still had their original architecture: tall, arched ceilings, faded wallpaper, and dim lighting that flickered more often than it should. I worked alongside another janitor, an older guy who had been there for years. He usually kept to himself, doing his rounds methodically. The nurses were polite but distant, too busy with their own work to pay much attention to me. Security guards roamed the halls occasionally, but for the most part, I was alone. The job was simple: cleaning rooms, emptying trash, mopping floors. Nothing out of the ordinary. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The first few hours were always the easiest. The hospital was still somewhat active, with doctors finishing up late-night rounds and nurses tending to patients. But after 2 a.m., the place would fall into an eerie stillness. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows, and every sound, no matter how small, felt unnaturally loud. The worst area was the old East Wing. It had been partially shut down years ago, with only a few rooms still in use for storage. The hallway leading to it was dimly lit, and the air always felt colder there, no matter the season. I was only assigned to clean that wing once a week, and even then, I made sure to finish quickly. Something about it just felt wrong. I remember one night in particular when I first started noticing things that didn't add up. It had been a long shift, and I was exhausted. The building was quiet, too quiet. I was mopping near the ICU when I heard something from down the hall. It wasn't a loud noise, just a faint tap, 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 like someone walking barefoot on the cold tiles. I turned, expecting to see a nurse or a patient out of bed. But the hallway was empty. I shook it off, assuming it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. After all, hospitals are full of sounds, machines beeping, doors creaking, air vents humming. It was nothing, or so I told myself. For the next few weeks, I went about my routine as usual. The job was tedious, but I got used to the rhythm. I avoided the East Wing whenever I could and stuck to the main areas. But as time went on, I started noticing more little things. Cleaning supplies wouldn't be where I left them. Doors that I had locked would be slightly ajar when I returned. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't have. I didn't mention it to anyone. Who would believe me? I figured it was just fatigue, or maybe the hospital's age making things creak and shift. But the feeling, that heavy, unsettling presence, never went away. The night it started, I was about 3 weeks into the job. By then, I had settled into the routine: clock in, grab my supplies, and start making my way through the hospital, floor by floor. The quiet still bothered me, but I had learned to ignore it. I figured as long as I stayed focused on my work and kept my mind occupied, the long shifts wouldn't feel so draining. That night was no different, or at least, that's what I thought. It was a Wednesday, right in the middle of the week, when the hospital felt even emptier than usual. The late-night rush had died down, and the only sounds were the occasional beeping of a heart monitor and the distant shuffle of nurses moving between patient rooms. At around 2 a.m., I was assigned to mop the East Wing. I hated going there. Most of it had been closed down years ago, but some rooms were still used for storing old equipment and unused hospital beds. The hallway leading there was long and dimly lit, with old wooden doors lining the walls, each one marked with a faded number. Some still had metal plaques with patient names, even though those rooms hadn't housed anyone in years. I moved quickly, pushing my mop across the tile floor, eager to get it over with. The place always felt colder than the rest of the hospital, and tonight was no different. The air had a distinct chill, making my breath feel heavier. I kept my head down and focused on finishing as fast as possible. Then I heard it. A soft shuffling sound. I froze, my hands gripping the mop handle. It was faint, barely more than a whisper of movement, coming from further down the hallway. It sounded like feet dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate. I turned my head slightly, peering down the hallway. It was empty. I swallowed, shaking off the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably a nurse looking for supplies. That had to be it. I forced myself to keep moving, dragging the mop across the tiles with long, steady strokes. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, scraping sound, like something being dragged. I turned fully now, my eyes scanning the dim hallway. The doors were all shut. The flickering fluorescent lights above cast long, dark shadows against the walls. My heart pounded in my chest. Hello? I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I took a step forward, straining my ears. The sound had stopped. The silence was thick, pressing in from all sides. My breathing was the only thing I could hear now, slow and shaky. I exhaled sharply and shook my head. Maybe it had been the old pipes or a draft pushing against one of the storage doors. Hospitals were full of noises, most of them unexplainable. I just needed to finish up and get out of there. I forced myself to move again, swiping the mop across the floor in hurried strokes. I reached the end of the hallway, next to one of the last doors on the right. Unlike the others, this door had a small window at eye level, covered in dust and grime. A faint outline of the room's interior was visible through the glass. I wasn't supposed to go in. That much I knew. Most of the rooms in this wing had been locked for years, and this one was no different. But as I turned to walk away, something stopped me. The door was open. Not wide open, just an inch or two, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I was sure it had been shut when I passed it earlier. I stared at it for a long moment, debating what to do. I knew I should just turn around and leave. I wasn't paid enough to investigate things that didn't make sense. But something inside me, the same part that always got me into trouble, pushed me forward. I reached out, gripping the edge of the door with hesitant fingers. It felt ice cold beneath my touch. Slowly, I nudged it open a little more. The hinges groaned softly, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. The room beyond was dark, barely illuminated by the faint glow of the hallway light spilling inside. My eyes adjusted, scanning the space. It was a patient room, long abandoned. An old hospital bed sat against the wall, its metal frame rusted with age. A single chair was pushed up against the far corner, next to an empty floor stand. The air was thick with dust, undisturbed for years. And yet, the chair was turned toward the door, as if someone had been sitting there, watching. A chill ran through me, my fingers tightening around the door handle. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Then, just as I was about to step back, something shifted. Not in the room. Behind me, a soft breath, warm against the back of my neck. My entire body locked up. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I didn't want to turn around. I knew I shouldn't turn around, but I did. The hallway was empty. Nothing but the same dimly lit corridor stretching back toward the main wing. The air around me felt thick, pressing in on my skin like static electricity. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to steady. I needed to leave. Now. I turned back to the room, ready to shut the door and pretend I had never seen it open. But the moment my eyes landed on the chair, it wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat there, a shape barely visible in the darkness, its form twisted and hunched. I couldn't see a face, just a vague outline, like a shadow darker than the rest of the room. I staggered back, slamming the door shut with shaking hands. The sound echoed down the hallway, breaking the heavy silence. My chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. I spun on my heel and started walking, fast. My mop and cleaning supplies were forgotten. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of that wing. The moment I stepped into the main corridor, the hospital felt normal again. The distant hum of machines, the occasional beep of monitors, everything was as it should be. But I knew what I had seen. I didn't mention it to anyone. Who would believe me? An exhausted janitor seeing things in a dimly lit hallway. I tried to convince myself that's all it was. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been in that room. The incident in the East Wing haunted me for days. I couldn't shake the image of the chair, how it had shifted, how the figure had sat there, waiting. I tried to go back to my usual routines, but something inside me had snapped. Every corner of the hospital felt different now. I was hyper-aware of the flickering lights, the creaking floors, and the cold spots that seemed to appear at the edges of my vision. I tried to push it all down, to dismiss it as nothing more than an overactive imagination, but that only lasted so long. It started with the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was a nurse or a security guard making their rounds. But the footsteps were too soft, too deliberate. They echoed through the halls, always just a few paces behind me. When it turned around, nothing was there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was a draft or the building settling, something, anything that made sense. But as the days went on, it became harder to dismiss. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the way the temperature seemed to drop whenever I was near certain rooms, the way the lights flickered every time I turned a corner. Each time I was near the east wing, my skin would crawl, as if something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself to avoid that part of the hospital, I had to go back. It was my job. The duties were the same, the hours still long. I had no choice but to face it. I started to notice other strange things, things I couldn't ignore. One morning, as I was cleaning the main hallway near the nurse's station, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darker than the others, flickering against the wall at the far end of the corridor. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer I looked, the more solid it seemed. Then, the shadow moved. It didn't just shift, it followed me. I turned around quickly, my heart racing, but when I looked again, the hallway was empty. Just the usual gray walls, the dim fluorescent lights buzzing softly above. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My fingers tightened around the mop handle, the cold sweat beginning to form along my neck. I tried to shake it off, as I always did. I finished my shift and went home, but I couldn't sleep. The hospital lingered in my mind, its quiet halls and empty rooms invading my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow again, and the chilling feeling of being followed, hunted, never left me. The next day, I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was going on. I had to go back to that room, the one I had slammed the door shut on. There was something about it, something wrong about it that I couldn't ignore. It was 2 a.m. again when I slipped away from my usual duties. The hospital was quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity stilled. I moved through the hallways with a sense of purpose, despite the knot tightening in my stomach. The east wing was dead silent as I approached it, the long corridor stretching out before me. I had to remind myself to breathe, to focus. It was just a room that was locked. Nothing to fear. But even as I told myself that, my feet felt heavy, each step a struggle. I knew it was foolish, but the compulsion to investigate was overwhelming. I walked to the door, which was, of course, still locked. But then I noticed something. The metal plaque on the door. The name was smudged, but I could make out the first few letters. LAU, I couldn't decipher the rest. Strange. The name was supposed to be clear. But it wasn't. The plaque had faded with time, but it wasn't just old age. Something had worn it away. I tugged at the door, half expecting it to creak open as it had before. But it didn't. It was locked. I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was the sound. A soft scraping. The same noise I had heard before. I froze, my heart pounding. This time, the sound was louder, more distinct. The walls seemed to vibrate with it. It was coming from inside the room. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow, the air around me suddenly too thick to breathe. The scraping continued, now accompanied by a low groan, like the building itself was shifting, protest. The sound was maddening, a horrible, relentless noise that made my skin crawl. I couldn't help myself. I reached out and pressed my ear to the door, my hand trembling. The sound was clearer now, faint but unmistakable, like something or someone was dragging their feet across the floor. I pulled away, my hand shaking. It was the same feeling I had before, when I had opened the door and seen the figure. That horrible, knowing sense that I wasn't alone. I couldn't stand it any longer. I turned and walked away, my legs stiff with fear. But as I did, I heard the door rattle. soft at first, but then harder, like someone was trying to break through. My pulse raced, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the doorway, but it was empty. The hallway was silent once again. I kept walking, faster now. I reached the main wing and ducked into the janitor's closet, my chest heaving as I leaned against the cold metal shelves. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. But even as I sat there, trying to steady my nerves, I heard it again. A faint scraping from somewhere deep within the hospital. And then a voice, soft, almost imperceptible, whispered my name. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, as if the hospital itself was alive, watching me, guiding me down a path I couldn't escape. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. I had to get to the bottom of this, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the more I uncovered, the less likely I was to make it out. That night, as I lay awake, my mind racing with possibilities, I knew one thing for sure. The hospital wasn't just old. It wasn't just abandoned in parts. It was haunted. And whatever had been following me was just getting started. It was a night like any other. The hospital was as quiet as it ever was at 2 a.m., save for the usual hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of a nurse's footsteps down the hall. Yet, the air felt different tonight. Thick, charged with a strange energy, something that made every breath feel like an effort. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more oppressive. The walls themselves felt like they were closing in. I couldn't sleep. Not after everything that had happened. Not after hearing that whisper or feeling the presence that had been shadowing me for days. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. The hospital had become a prison, each room and hallway a dark cell. Tonight, there was no avoiding it. Tonight, I was going to face whatever was in the East Wing. I stood at the edge of the hallway, staring at the locked door I had been avoiding for so long. The flickering light above me cast strange shadows, stretching the darkness, distorting the familiar. My feet felt heavy, like they were stuck in quicksand, but I had no choice now. I had already come too far. The sounds, the scraping, the footsteps, the voice had all led me to this moment. There was no turning back. I wasn't sure what I was about to find, but I knew one thing. Whatever it was, I couldn't ignore it any longer. With a shaking hand, I reached out and touched the doorknob. It was cold. Too cold. I tried not to think about it, tried not to let the chill crawl into my bones, but it was impossible. I turned the knob. It was unlocked. A rush of panic surged through me, and my heart pounded in my chest. I stepped into the room, the light from the hallway spilling in just enough to reveal the edges of the space. The air in here was suffocating, thick with dust, with an unnatural weight. My breath came in short, panic bursts. I didn't want to go further. I didn't want to see what was inside. But the door was open now. I had to know. I took one step inside, then another. The floor creaked under my weight, each step louder than the last. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift as if they were alive, watching me. I could barely see anything at first. The room was mostly empty, save for the broken furniture and scattered medical supplies. It was the same as it had been before. At least, that's what I told myself. Then, I saw it. The chair. The one I had seen that first night. It was sitting in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. But this time, there was something different. The chair wasn't empty anymore. Someone, or something, was sitting in it. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The figure in the chair didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. It was a shadow, a silhouette in the darkness, but it was there. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no clothing, no features. But I could feel its presence. It was like the air around it was alive, crackling with energy, with something dark and ancient. My gut twisted in horror. The room seemed to grow colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as a chill seeped into my skin. I had to get out. I had to run, but my feet were cemented to the floor, my legs shaking uncontrollably. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, a rasping breath. The figure in the chair had moved. It was a subtle motion at first, just a shift of the shoulders, but I knew what it meant. It was aware of me, and it was waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in that moment, caught in the unrelenting gaze of something I couldn't understand. The figure in the chair slowly turned its head, and for the first time, I saw its face. It was twisted, grotesque, a mask of death and decay, with hollow eyes that stared into mine like black voids. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out. Just the sense that it was trying to speak, to communicate something beyond my understanding. And then I felt it. The weight of its gaze pressing down on me. It was suffocating, unbearable. My heart hammered in my chest, my lungs struggling to take in air. The shadows around the figure seemed to stretch and curl, wrapping themselves around me, choking me with their darkness. A voice, my voice, echoed in my mind. It was a whisper at first, too faint to hear, but it grew louder, clearer, until it was all I could hear. You shouldn't have come here. The words were not spoken aloud, but I felt them. They reverberated through my skull, through my very soul. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing in on me, the air thick with the stench of decay. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy in my mouth. I tried to move, to get away, but my body refused to obey. My mind was screaming for me to run, but I was trapped in place, locked in the gaze of something far beyond my understanding. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the room went silent. The shadows retreated. The figure in the chair was gone. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it now. The presence right behind me. Cold, malicious. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to handle it. Instead, I backed away slowly, step by trembling step. My body was screaming for me to get out, but the fear, the absolute terror, kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't let go of the feeling that something was following me, something that would drag me back into the room if I didn't move fast enough. I stumbled toward the door, my breath ragged in my throat, my legs shaking. But just as my hand reached for the doorknob, I heard it again. You shouldn't have come here. The voice echoed, a soft hiss in my ear. I turned around, but nothing was there. I had to leave. I had to get out. I ran, stumbling down the hallway as fast as my legs could carry me. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat a sharp reminder that I was still alive. But even as I bolted through the maze of corridors, I couldn't shake the cold, the suffocating weight of that presence that had haunted me. It felt like something was still following, watching from the shadows. Every hallway seemed endless, every turn only leading to more darkness. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. I finally reached the main entrance, the heavy glass doors gleaming in the dim light. I pushed against the door, but it didn't budge. It was locked. Panic surged through me as I pulled and shoved, but nothing worked. I was trapped inside. I turned back toward the hospital's interior, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The sounds of my footsteps echoed through the halls like a haunting reminder of my isolation. And yet, there was no sound but my own, nothing that felt real. That was when I heard it, the unmistakable rustling of fabric, a soft scrape against the tile. And then, a low, haunting sound, the sound of something breathing. I whipped around, my eyes darting over the corridor. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The silence was deafening. I stumbled backward, almost falling into the wall. I was losing my mind. I had to get out. I had to. But my body felt frozen, as if the hospital itself was holding me in place. It was like I was caught in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The fear that had gripped me only moments ago had transformed into something darker, more insidious. The whispers were getting louder now. They were no longer just in my mind. They were all around me, in the very air I breathed. You shouldn't have come here. The voice, distorted and cold, filled the space, pressing down on me from all sides. My breath hitched in my throat, my chest tightening. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had no choice. I had to leave. I finally found the emergency exit, and this time, the door opened. The cold night air hit me like a shock to the system. I blinked, the harsh light of the outside world blinding me for a moment, but I didn't care. I was out. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping for air as if I had been underwater for hours. The night felt too quiet, too still. The parking lot was deserted, and the distant hum of traffic was the only sound that greeted me. But even as I stepped away from the building, I knew that leaving the hospital hadn't been enough. The shadows would follow. Whatever had been inside that hospital, whatever had been tormenting me, wasn't just confined to those walls. I didn't know how, but I felt it. The presence hadn't left. I started my car without thinking, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the deserted street. I didn't care where I was going, just as long as I was far away from that place. My hands shook against the steering wheel, the night blurring past me in a haze of motion. The further I drove, the more distant the hospital became. The sense of relief that washed over me should have been comforting. But it wasn't. The fear was still there, lurking in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't outrun it. It was with me, in the back of my mind, like an unwanted companion that would never let go. Even as I drove, even as I tried to tell myself that I had escaped, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. The following weeks were a blur. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep. The hospital, the figure in the chair, the whispering voice, they haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. That face. Those eyes. I couldn't escape the image of them staring back at me, hollow and empty. I could feel it watching me in the corner of my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, that I had just been exhausted, caught in the grip of stress and fear. But the fear wouldn't go away. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of light, every dark corner, everything reminded me of the hospital. I went to the police. They didn't believe me. How could they? It sounded insane, even to me. I was just another person who had imagined something. The hospital had been shut down months ago. No staff, no patients. No one to talk to about it, to corroborate my story. The police dismissed me as just another overworked worker seeing things in the dead of night. They had no answers for me, no closure. They couldn't explain it. I didn't know what I was hoping for. I didn't know what I wanted them to say. But it didn't matter. The unease, the fear, the feeling of being hunted, it was still there. Inescapable. It's been a few months since I left, since I drove away from that cursed place. The hospital is still there, boarded up, abandoned, and silent. Yet I can't shake the feeling that something lingers. A presence that refuses to be forgotten. And no matter how far I run, no matter how much time passes, it will follow me. I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself that I was just imagining it, that the terror was in my mind. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world, things that can't be explained, things that can't be reasoned with. And once you've crossed paths with them, there's no going back, no running away. It's been years since I left that place. The memories of the hospital, the figure, the whispers, they still haunt me. I can't help but wonder, every time I turn a corner or hear a noise in the middle of the night, if the thing that tormented me is still out there. Waiting, watching. You may be wondering if I ever went back, if I ever found out what really happened in that place. The answer is no, I couldn't. Even though the hospital was long abandoned, boarded up and forgotten by the rest of the world, I knew deep down that it was never going to let me go. Not really. Some nights, I think about going back. I think about walking through those halls again, confronting whatever it was that I saw, whatever it was that made me feel so small, so powerless. But something holds me back. Something stops me from opening that door. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's something else, something more primal. A gut feeling that the moment I stepped foot on that ground again, I'll be dragged back into that nightmare that I'll never escape. In the years since, I've tried to move on with my life. I've tried to find peace, tried to convince myself that the terror was all in my head. But that's the thing about fear. It stays with you. It sinks into your bones. No matter how much you try to bury it, it rises back up when you least expect it. I've stopped going to hospitals altogether. I know that sounds irrational, but I can't help it. Every time I see those sterile white walls, hear the faint beep of medical machines, I feel that same cold grip tightening around my chest. I know it sounds crazy, but every time I walk into one, I wonder if I'll see that figure again. If I'll hear that voice. If I'll be trapped in that nightmare once more. It's not just the hospitals. It's the night itself. The quiet. It's like there's something in the darkness that's always watching, waiting for me to slip up. For me to lose my grip. Every shadow, every flicker of light sends a chill down my spine, reminding me that the thing in the hospital wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. And whatever it was, it hasn't let go of me. I've spoken to a few people who used to work at that hospital. None of them have anything helpful to say. They were just as shaken up as I was, as if something about that place had changed them. They look at you with wide, nervous eyes when you ask about it, and then they quickly change the subject. It's almost as if they know something they're not willing to share, like they've seen things they don't want to speak of. I wonder if anyone else has experienced what I did. Maybe I'm not the only one. Maybe others have seen the same figure, heard the same whispers. I've never been able to find any answers, though. There are no records of anything unusual happening there. No mention of strange occurrences in any of the official documents. But deep down, I know the truth. The hospital was a place of sickness, of death, of people losing their fight for survival. There's no way those energies don't leave a mark. No way that kind of pain, that kind of suffering, can just vanish. Somewhere in the quiet, somewhere in the dark, I know it's still there. And it's waiting for me to slip, to make that one mistake that will drag me back into its grasp. I think that's what haunts me the most. The thought that we don't always know what's lurking beneath the surface. That there are things in this world that can't be explained. Things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we'll never understand them. All we can do is try to survive them, try to escape their grip. One late autumn evening, a few of us decided to head into the forest. There was no reason other than curiosity and the usual banter that comes with being in your early 20s, believing you're invincible, and that the stories about the woods were just exaggerated whispers from the older generation. It was me, a few friends, and a couple of guys from town. We were all about to make a decision we'd later regret, and at the time, we had no idea what we were about to walk into. We gathered near the edge of the woods, standing in the fading daylight. There was an oddly stillness in the air, the kind you get just before something changes. No birds were singing, and the wind had died down completely. It felt almost as if the forest was holding its breath. That eerie silence felt out of place, but again, we shrugged it off. We joked about how we'd finally proved the stories wrong, dismissing the tension in the air as nothing more than nerves. Let's get in there and prove once and for all that there's nothing to these stories, one of the guys said, already starting down the well-trodden path that led into the trees. The first few steps were easy, familiar even. The path was covered with fallen leaves that crunched beneath our feet, and everything seemed like it was supposed to. I remember looking back at the town one last time, the warm glow of the streetlights fading as we moved deeper into the darkening woods. The familiar houses and roads slowly became a distant memory, swallowed by the thickening trees. The air grew colder as we ventured further in, and the forest started to feel like it was closing in around us. It was strange, but nothing felt immediately threatening. Still, there was this subtle heaviness to the atmosphere, something pressing down that we couldn't quite pinpoint. We were all talking, joking, trying to act like we weren't on edge, but it didn't take long for that uneasy feeling to creep up on us. As we moved deeper into the woods, we came across an old stone well. It was barely visible at first, covered in ivy, half buried under a blanket of leaves. The well looked ancient, like it had been forgotten by time. It was one of those places that seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong in the middle of the forest. We all stood around it for a moment, curious, but no one dared to get too close. I don't know why, but the sight of it just felt wrong. "Hey, look at this," someone said, pointing toward the ground near the well. "There are old markings on the stones." There were strange symbols etched into the stones surrounding the well, worn down with age, but still visible. At the time, we didn't know what they meant. We didn't even try to decipher them. We figured it was just some old relic of the past, something a long-forgotten civilization had left behind. But I remember feeling an uncomfortable chill run through me when my eyes lingered on the markings for just a moment too long. We shrugged it off, of course. We laughed about how it was probably just some weird old thing people had come across before us. We took a few pictures, joked some more, and carried on down the path. But the stillness in the air had only grown heavier. We were in the forest longer than we'd intended. The sun had set completely, and the full moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light through the dense trees. Everything was eerily quiet, no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the forest had gone completely silent. That's when we first noticed it. We weren't sure what we were seeing at first, but something in the distance moved between the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too large, too human in shape. It seemed to drift, moving slowly, purposefully, but with no sound. We stopped in our tracks, every single one of us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Did you see that?" one of my friends whispered, his voice shaking. We all nodded, but no one said anything. We just stared at the spot where the figure had been. It wasn't there anymore. That's when I started to feel it, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was afraid. There was no denying it. We weren't alone in those woods, and whatever it was that was watching us, I didn't think it had any intention of letting us leave. As we continued, that sense of being watched grew stronger. It felt like eyes were on us from every angle, following our every move, though whenever we looked, we saw nothing. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had an urge to turn around, to go back, but none of us said anything. We kept going deeper, as if we were drawn forward by something we couldn't name. It wasn't until we reached a small clearing that we stopped to take a breath. But that was when the air seemed to thicken again, when the cold seemed to seep into our bones, and when I noticed the trees surrounding us, how they weren't just trees, but something far older and far more sinister. I had never felt fear like that in my life. The forest was no longer the same place it had been when we first entered. It wasn't just a collection of trees anymore. It felt like a living, breathing thing, an entity that was very aware of our presence. I had the undeniable feeling that we had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. We stood in that clearing for what felt like an eternity, none of us daring to speak, as if saying something aloud would somehow break the fragile silence. The forest around us was unnaturally still. The usual sounds you'd expect in the woods, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, were gone. The moon hung high above, casting long, stark shadows, but the eerie stillness refused to lift. It wasn't until I looked to my left, beyond the trees, that I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing with my mind. But then it moved again, this time more clearly, almost deliberately. The figure wasn't human. At least, not in the way I understood it. It was tall, much taller than any of us, and it seemed to glide between the trunks of the trees without making a single sound. No crunching leaves, no snapping of twigs, just an eerie silence as it moved deeper into the woods. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, and for a moment, I couldn't even bring myself to speak. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place. All I could do was stare at it, too terrified to look away. Did you? Did you see that? I heard one of my friends whisper, his voice barely audible. His eyes were wide, locked on the same spot where he'd seen the figure. I nodded, my mouth dry. I couldn't find the words to describe what I had just seen, let alone make sense of it. My mind raced as I tried to come up with an explanation. It had to be something rational, right? Maybe an animal? A trick of the light? But I knew deep down that it wasn't any of those things. The feeling in my gut told me this wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was something far worse. It's nothing, I managed to say, my voice trembling despite myself. Probably just some animal. But the words didn't sound convincing, not even to me. No one said anything in response. We just stood there, staring into the darkness where the figure had disappeared, waiting for it to reappear. But it didn't. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, and the feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Maybe we should turn back, another voice suggested, a little too quickly. We've been out here long enough, right? We all looked at each other, the suggestion hanging in the air like a lifeline. I saw the hesitation in their eyes, the same fear that I felt clawing at me from the inside. None of us wanted to be the first to admit that we were scared, but the longer we stood there in that clearing, the more real the fear became. I agree, one of the guys finally spoke up. Let's head back. We've seen enough. But even as we turned to leave, something didn't feel right. The air was colder now, biting into our skin, and the path back to the edge of the forest seemed longer than it had been before. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything, lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the same dark expanse of trees, silent and still. Yet the unease still gripped me, tightening around my chest, making it hard to breathe. We moved forward, our footsteps quickening as we walked back down the narrow trail, but the tension didn't ease. The forest seemed to close in on us, pressing down from all sides. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt too loud, too deliberate, as if something was keeping track of our every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was following us just out of sight. Then, it happened again. It was subtle at first. A faint rustling from behind, just on the edge of my hearing. But when I turned around, there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the same trees, the same oppressive silence. But I wasn't the only one who had heard it. My friend who had suggested we leave was looking behind us too, his eyes wide with growing concern. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded again, my mouth dry. "Yeah, I heard it too." The others had stopped as well, and for a brief moment, we all stood there in the middle of the path, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, thudding louder with each passing second. "I think we should go faster," one of the other guys said, his voice tight with fear. Without a word, we began to walk faster, then break into a jog, the sound of our shoes hitting the ground filling the air, each step seeming to echo through the trees. But the faster we moved, the more I began to feel that oppressive weight on my chest, that sensation of being pursued. The more I tried to outrun it, the closer it seemed to get. I heard it again, a quick rustle behind us, louder now, as if something or someone was definitely following us. I didn't dare to look back this time. I just kept running, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't going to make it out of the woods in one piece. "Guys," one of my friends panted, his voice panicked. "We need to get out of here. This place. It's not right." But the path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. We had been running for what felt like miles, yet the edge of the forest was nowhere in sight. The air had grown colder still, and the trees around us seemed to close in tighter, as if they were shifting, narrowing the trail. Then, something else happened, something that sent a jolt of cold terror straight through my veins. I looked up ahead, where the path was slightly illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees. And there, standing in the middle of the path, was the same figure I had seen earlier. It was tall, taller than any of us, and it stood perfectly still, its form almost blending with the shadows. But there was no mistaking it. We skidded to a halt, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, as we all stared at the figure, paralyzed with fear. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching us, as if it had been waiting for us to arrive. One of my friends let out a strangled gasp and tried to move past the figure, but as soon as he took a step forward, the figure's head snapped toward him, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. We froze, every instinct screaming at us to run, but we couldn't move. We were trapped. "Go!" I shouted, finally breaking the paralysis. But it was too late. The figure didn't move toward us. It didn't need to. We were already running again, faster than before, with a sense of urgency that I had never felt in my life. My heart raced, my feet barely touching the ground as we sprinted down the path, the trees blurring past us. But the figure, somehow, was still with us, always just behind. The feeling of being chased, being hunted, gnawed at my every step. We didn't stop running until the forest finally opened up, and we could see the edge of the trees and the lights of the town in the distance. The moment we broke free from the woods, the tension, the weight, seemed to lift. But I knew it wasn't over. That thing, that figure, wasn't going to let us go that easily. We had crossed into its domain, and I knew deep down we weren't the last to feel its presence. The air was thick with unease. We hadn't spoken much since the night in the forest. What could we say? None of us could shake the image of the figure, standing in the darkness, its eyes locked on us with an unnerving stillness. We had returned to town, but the fear, the nagging sense that something was still watching, hadn't left. It followed us, lurking in the corners of our minds. We tried to go back to our daily routines, but even in the familiarity of home, the forest had left its mark. The days that followed were restless. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like the woods were still there, just beyond the horizon, waiting. My friends, too, seemed on edge. We hadn't spoken of it again, but we all knew. The figure was never far from our thoughts. It started with small things, barely noticeable at first. A flicker in the corner of my eye when I was walking down the street, the faintest sensation of being followed. It'd turn around, but there would be nothing there. It was as if the forest had reached out and touched my life, weaving its strange presence into the fabric of the mundane. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, trying to unwind after a long day. The sun had set, and the cool evening air settled in, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. But there was something off about the sounds of the night. It wasn't the usual evening chorus of crickets and distant dogs barking. The silence was heavy, unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a faint rustling from the woods behind my house. My heart skipped a beat, my senses going on high alert. I stood up, peering into the darkness, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Just the wind, moving the branches in a way that almost seemed deliberate. My mind raced, playing tricks on me. It was just a squirrel, right? Or maybe an owl. I wasn't alone, after all. My dog was with me, sitting calmly on the porch, looking around as if he heard nothing out of the ordinary. But then, the rustling came again, and this time, it was closer. My dog's ears perked up, and he gave a low growl, something I had never heard from him before. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was something else, something more deliberate, more intentional. I stepped off the porch and walked toward the edge of my yard, trying to peer through the trees. There, in the shadowed undergrowth, I thought I saw something moving just beyond the range of the porch light. I couldn't make it out clearly, but the shape was tall, and for a moment, it seemed to sway with the breeze, almost like it was waiting. I froze. My dog's growl deepened, and I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but I knew instinctively that it wasn't something natural. It wasn't just an animal, The figure was too still, too deliberate. My breath quickened as I took a step back, retreating to the safety of my porch. The moment I moved, the rustling stopped. The night was once again eerily quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape, standing just out of view, waiting, watching. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Even in broad daylight, as I went about my usual tasks, running errands, meeting friends, walking through town, I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the sense that someone or something was just behind me, moving through the crowd without a sound. It wasn't long before the others started noticing it too. We hadn't spoken about our experiences, but one by one, my friends came to me, their faces pale, their voices low. "I keep hearing footsteps," one of them confessed, her voice shaky. "I'll be in my room, and I'll hear someone walking around outside my door, like they're waiting for me to open it. But when I do, there's nothing there." Another friend told me that he woke up in the middle of the night to find his blinds moving slightly, as though someone had been watching him through the window. And yet, when he checked, there was no one there, no sign of anyone having been outside at all. We all seemed to be caught in the same strange web, each of us experiencing something different, but all of us feeling the same pervasive dread. The woods hadn't let go of us. It had followed us home, and now it was encroaching on every part of our lives. There was only one thing left to do: go back to the forest. But this time, we weren't just going to run. This time, we would face whatever it was that had followed us. We gathered together, each of us with a mixture of fear and determination in our eyes, and set out to find answers. No one spoke much as we walked back into the woods, the weight of the air pressing down on us, each of us afraid to acknowledge the truth, that something was there, something that didn't belong. We walked for hours, the path winding deeper into the heart of the forest, the trees growing denser, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the light. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest felt. The air grew thick with an almost oppressive silence. Even the sounds of animals had disappeared. There was nothing, just an eerie stillness. "Do you guys feel that?" one of my friends whispered, his voice barely audible over the crunching of our footsteps. "It's like we're not alone." I didn't need to answer. I felt it too. The air was heavier here, thick with something unseen. I could almost taste it, like metal on my tongue, like the air before a storm. I wasn't sure what we were looking for, but I knew we had to keep going. We had to understand what was happening. We made our way to the clearing where we had seen the figure before. The same spot where we had stopped, frozen in fear, unable to move. But now it was different. The clearing seemed darker, more oppressive, as if the very trees around it were leaning in, watching us. I didn't want to step into the middle of the clearing, but it was too late. As if drawn by some invisible force, I found myself moving forward, my legs carrying me against my will. My friends followed, their faces grim, their eyes darting around nervously. It wasn't long before we realized that we weren't just standing in a clearing. It was something more. The ground beneath our feet felt soft, almost spongy, as though something was buried underneath. The trees around us looked strange, twisted, warped, as though they were reaching out with gnarled limbs to ensnare us. And then we saw it, a mark on one of the trees. A symbol carved into the bark with precise, deliberate strokes. It was nothing I had ever seen before, but the moment I laid eyes on it, a cold wave of dread washed over me. One of my friends stepped forward, reaching out to touch the symbol, but the moment his fingers brushed against the tree, a low rumble echoed through the ground. The forest seemed to shake, and the air grew colder still, biting into my skin. I wanted to run. My body screamed at me to turn and flee, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The mark on the tree seemed to pulse, and I heard a soft voice, just at the edge of my hearing, whispering something I couldn't understand. And that's when the ground shifted beneath us. The forest seemed to come alive, twisting and shifting in unnatural ways. The trees creaked and groaned as if they were alive, their branches reaching out, clawing at the air. We were no longer alone. The figure, whatever it was here. And this time, it was close. Too close. Run! Someone screamed, and we didn't hesitate. We turned and ran, the sound of our footsteps pounding against the ground, the trees closing in behind us. The darkness seemed to chase us, the oppressive weight of the forest pressing down, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. Whatever was out there in the woods wasn't finished with us. It had just begun. The earth beneath us felt unstable, like it was shifting with every step we took. We ran, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was no longer just solid, it was alive. The trees around us had stopped swaying with the wind, standing eerily still as if watching our every movement. The air was thick with a coldness that chilled me to my very core, sinking deep into my bones. My lungs burned with the effort of running, but I couldn't stop. There was something behind us, something that we couldn't outrun, and it was drawing closer with every passing second. The sound of footsteps, too slow, too deliberate, echoed through the forest behind us. It wasn't our own. My heart pounded in my chest, the beat frantic and erratic as I forced my legs to move faster, to break free from the terror closing in on us. My friends were just ahead of me, but the distance between us seemed to grow with each step. My breaths came out in ragged gasps, my vision swimming as I tried to keep up. I couldn't hear anything over the pounding of my heart, the rush of blood in my ears. But then, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the forest, everything went silent. The footsteps stopped. The wind ceased to blow. The forest, once alive with sound and motion, became a deathly stillness. My feet slowed against my will, the instinct to flee overwhelmed by a sense of dread that rooted me to the spot. I looked up and realized, to my horror, that we had come to a clearing. The same clearing where it had all started. And there, standing at the center of it, was the figure. It wasn't the same as before. The shape and the shadows had been fleeting, ghostly, an indistinct figure in the dark. But now, in the full light of the moon, the creature was clear. And it was horrifying. It was tall, so tall that it seemed to stretch impossibly high into the trees above. Its limbs were unnaturally long, too thin to be human. The skin, if it could be called skin, was a pale, almost translucent white, stretched too tightly over its bones. Its face, if you could call it a face, was a twisted mockery of a human's. Hollow eyes stared at us, black pits that seemed to draw in all the light, and its mouth, wide, too wide, was nothing more than a gaping hole. There were no features, no nose, no ears, just that impossibly wide mouth and the endless, soulless eyes. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. We stopped, frozen in place. No one spoke. We couldn't. It was as if the very air had been stolen from our lungs. My body refused to obey me, my legs shaking beneath me, my throat dry. The terror was so overwhelming that I could barely comprehend what was happening. And then it did move. Slowly, deliberately, the figure took a step forward. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The thing didn't make a sound as it moved, but its presence filled the space, overwhelming all of our senses. It was as if it was closing in on us from all sides, suffocating us with its proximity. My heart raced, pounding so loudly in my chest that I feared the others could hear it. The panic surged inside me, but there was nowhere to run. We were trapped in the clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, as if reaching down to trap us. One of my friends, Jamie, I think, was the first to break. He took a step back, his voice trembling as he whispered, "What? Is that thing?" His words were barely audible, but they cut through the silence like a knife. I wanted to answer, but my throat was too tight. I couldn't form the words. How could I explain the thing that stood before us? How could I describe the horror in front of us, the thing that defied all logic and reason? Then, without warning, the figure tilted its head, the movement so unnaturally fluid that it sent a chill down my spine. Its eyes, those endless black pits, focused on Jamie. and I could see it. The thing was smiling. That horrifying, gaping mouth spread wider, impossibly wide, until it looked like it could consume the entire world. The air seemed to warp around it, bending and twisting, like reality itself couldn't hold its shape in the presence of the creature. Suddenly, the figure took another step forward, then another. It was getting closer, and the air grew colder, sharper, like it was being drawn into the thing's gaze. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, as if something was squeezing the air from my lungs. The others were standing still, eyes wide, frozen in fear. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even an animalistic growl. It was a sound, no, more like a vibration, a hum that rattled my very bones. It felt as if it was coming from everywhere at once, inside my head, in my chest, in my ears. The words it spoke were foreign, incomprehensible, but they carried weight. The moment it spoke, the forest seemed to respond, the trees around us groaning, the ground trembling beneath our feet. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were clear. The tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a promise. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if I had been rooted to the ground by some unseen force, my legs unable to respond, my voice lost in my throat. And then the world exploded. The figure lunged forward, faster than anything should have been able to move. I didn't have time to react. There was a blur of motion, and before I could even comprehend what was happening, it was upon us. The air around us shattered with a deafening crash, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. My friends screamed, long, terrified screams that were cut off as quickly as they began. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, and suddenly I was falling, plummeting into an abyss of darkness. The world around me spun in an uncontrollable blur, the sound of my heart hammering in my chest, drowning out everything else. My skin crawled as the sensation of something cold and clammy brushed against my arm. I reached out, my hand grasping at nothing, but I couldn't stop falling. I couldn't escape the darkness. When I finally hit the ground, the impact knocked the wind out of me. I gasped for breath. The cold, damp earth beneath me, an unexpected comfort compared to the terror of the fall. I lay there, dazed, trying to piece together what had just happened. But as I pushed myself up, my eyes widening in shock, I realized something. I wasn't alone. The figure was still there, standing just a few feet away, watching me. Its eyes locked on mine, that unblinking stare sending a cold wave of terror through my entire being. It hadn't moved. It hadn't followed me. It was just waiting for me to understand. And then, as if the weight of everything that had happened finally sank in, I heard a voice, my own voice, whisper in my mind. "It's not over." I couldn't hear the others. The silence was suffocating, and in the pit of my stomach, I realized that something had happened to them. They weren't here anymore. I didn't know where they'd gone, or what had happened to them, but they were gone. I couldn't hear their breathing, their footsteps, or their screams. Just the oppressive silence, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to move, my legs shaky beneath me, but the figure's gaze was like a physical force, paralyzing me. It wasn't just the fear anymore. It was something deeper, something ancient. I felt as though my soul itself was being weighed down, pulled into the depths of the creature's presence. I wanted to run, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The air around me was thick, suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in. I glanced around, desperately searching for a way out, but the trees had shifted. What had once been a familiar path, the one we had used to enter the forest, was now completely obscured. The dense undergrowth had grown taller. The branches of the trees twisted into unnatural shapes, blocking any potential escape. There was no way forward, no way out. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its long limbs swaying with an eerie fluidity. My heart skipped a beat, and I took an instinctive step backward. But before I could retreat further, I heard a sound behind me. A voice! It was faint, distant at first, but it was there. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, hoping to see one of my friends, anyone, but there was no one there. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "Don't listen to it." It was Jamie's voice. I spun around again, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. My heart hammered against my chest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The forest felt different, less hostile, less oppressive. The figure was still there, watching me, but now it was, waiting, almost expectant. "Jamie?" I whispered, my voice hoarse, trembling with fear. I didn't know if I could trust it, but there was something in the air, something that told me I had to respond. I had to act. Another voice, this time from behind me again. "Get out. It's not safe." I turned sharply, half expecting to see one of the others standing there, but there was no one. The voice was in my mind, coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't explain. My skin prickled with dread, but I knew that I had to listen. The thing standing before me had never been alive. It wasn't a creature from this world, but something far darker. Something that fed on fear. "Get out. Run, before it's too late." I didn't know if it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind, but something inside me clicked. The feeling that had been growing, that deep, gnawing sense of dread that had clouded my thoughts, was slowly being replaced with something else. A strange clarity. I had to leave, no matter what. The air around me grew heavier again as the figure's mouth began to twitch, its grotesque grin widening impossibly. It wasn't going to let me go. I realized then that it had been waiting for me to make a choice. It wasn't going to release me willingly. It would only let me leave if I could confront it, if I could resist it long enough to break free. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a physical entity. It was something far older, far more insidious than any creature. It was a presence, a force that thrived on fear, on the helplessness of those who wandered into its domain. It had no form, no shape. It was the embodiment of terror itself. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. There was no fighting it, no defeating it. There was only surviving it. I began to back away slowly, cautiously, keeping my eyes fixed on the creature. Its gaze remained locked on me, but there was no movement, no rush. Just that horrific, unblinking stare. "Leave," I muttered under my breath, my voice more confident now. "Leave me alone." The figure twitched, its body jerking slightly, as if it had heard me. I took another step back, then another, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the creature's form began to dissolve into the shadows of the trees. It didn't vanish all at once, but rather like smoke, its shape melting into the night, until only the faintest outline remained. It was leaving, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran harder than it had ever run before. Through the trees, past the broken branches and tangled vines. My legs burned with the effort. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of that forest, away from whatever that thing was. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the oppressive air lifted. The coldness that had weighed me down evaporated. The trees seemed less twisted, less threatening, and the oppressive silence was broken by the sounds of the forest returning to normal. Birds chirped in the distance, the wind began to rustle the leaves again, and the ground beneath me felt solid once more. I didn't stop running. Not until I had reached the edge of the forest, where the trees finally gave way to the wide, open field. When I looked back, there was nothing. No dark figure standing in the shadows. No sign that anything unusual had ever happened. It was over, or so I thought. Days passed, and I found myself back in my normal life, back in my own home, away from the nightmare that had been the forest. But the thing was, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow, black eyes staring back at me. Every time I heard a rustling sound behind me, I would freeze, expecting it to be there. Waiting, watching. There was no closure, no real resolution. And so, I live with it now, a part of me always on edge, waiting for it to return. Because deep down, I know the truth. It's never truly gone. The forest is still out there. And so is the thing that waits in the dark. It's been years now since that night, the night that changed everything. The night I stumbled upon something that should have remained hidden, locked away in the depths of the forest, buried beneath layers of history and forgotten lore. But I can't escape it. It haunts me, not in the way you'd expect, not in the physical sense. No, this isn't a haunting of the mind. It's something else, something far more insidious. I've tried to move on, to bury it beneath the layers of my day-to-day life. I've moved from town to town, changed jobs, even tried to shut out the memories of the forest. But it doesn't matter. That thing, whatever it was, has a way of reaching into the deepest recesses of your mind. It lingers there, waiting, patient as ever, like the creeping fog on a cold morning. It isn't just the image of that figure standing in the clearing, watching me, that haunts me. It's the silence, the way everything went still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. The feeling of something ancient and powerful, pressing in from all sides. The feeling that the forest, that place, wasn't just a location. It was a part of something much bigger, something that stretched far beyond the confines of our understanding. Even now, when I walk through a park or a forest on a casual afternoon, I can't shake the sensation that I'm being watched. That something is following me, just out of sight. Maybe it's paranoia, maybe it's a trick of the mind, but I've come to realize that you never truly leave that kind of experience behind. It's like a shadow that stretches out with you wherever you go. There are days when I feel the pressure building, when the weight of those memories becomes too much to bear, and I start to wonder if I'm losing my mind. Is it possible to go through something like that and come out unscathed? Maybe the real danger isn't the creature itself, but the lingering imprint it leaves on your soul, the way it reprograms your understanding of the world. I find myself questioning everything. How many times have I passed by a forest and wondered if it's waiting there, watching me, just beyond the trees? How many times have I felt the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, knowing that I'm not alone, even in the middle of a crowded street? There are moments, fleeting and terrifying, when I hear those voices again, the voices of my friends, calling out to me from somewhere deep in the woods. I know it's impossible. I know they're gone. But there's something about the way they say my name, something desperate and pleading in their tones, that makes me wonder if they're still out there. Trapped. Lost in that place where the rules of reality no longer apply. I've looked for them, of course. I've returned to the forest more times than I care to admit, hoping that somehow I could find answers. But each time I've come back empty-handed. The forest is unchanged, as if it's an eternal, stagnant place that refuses to give up its secrets. No matter how many times I walk those paths, no matter how long I search, the forest remains silent, untouched by the passage of time. It's as if it's waiting for something or someone. And then there are nights, late at night, when I lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The weight of the darkness presses in from all sides. It's on those nights that I can hear the rustling again, the soft sound of leaves brushing against each other in the wind. It sounds so familiar, so close. And for a split second, I'll swear that I hear a voice. But when I sit up, when I strain my ears to listen, there's nothing. Just the quiet, oppressive silence that fills the room. I've stopped trying to explain it. Maybe that's what bothers me the most, that there is no explanation. The creature, the figure, the presence in the woods, it didn't make sense then, and it doesn't make sense now. But I've come to realize that not everything has to make sense. Some things can't be explained, and trying to rationalize them only makes the terror worse. The fear isn't in understanding, it's in the unknown, in the parts of life that defy explanation. It's in the realization that there are forces at work in this world that are beyond our comprehension. Maybe the forest isn't just a physical place, it's something more. Something that transcends time and space. Maybe it's a reminder, a warning from whatever it is that lurks there, waiting. A reminder that the world isn't as safe and predictable as we think. It is a reminder that there are things we can't control, things that operate on a level so far beyond us that they make our understanding of the universe seem insignificant. I've stopped telling people about what happened that night. Who would believe me? Who would understand? They'd say it was a nightmare, a bad experience in the woods, a trick of the mind. They wouldn't get it. They wouldn't understand the way the forest felt, the way it seemed to twist and bend the very laws of nature. No, it's better this way. Better to keep it to myself, to bury it deep where no one else can see. And yet, every time I look out the window, every time I walk past a wooded area, I can feel it just beneath the surface. The knowledge that I am not alone. That thing is still out there, still waiting, still watching. And though I may have escaped once, I know that it hasn't forgotten me. Maybe that's what frightens me the most. It's not that I can't forget, it's that it won't let me. It lingers like a dark cloud on the horizon, always just out of sight, but never too far. This isn't just another tale of some spooky place far off in the distance. It's something I lived through. This story takes place at an old, forgotten hotel tucked in the corner of a quiet town. It's a place that, on the surface, seemed normal enough. Or at least, that's what I thought. A few years ago, I found myself in need of a place to stay during a road trip. I had been driving for hours, hoping to make it to my destination before nightfall, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I realized I wouldn't make it. I'd driven through endless stretches of highway, with little more than fields and trees to keep me company. My stomach was growling, and the headlights of my car barely illuminated the empty roads ahead. When I finally saw a sign for a hotel up ahead, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The hotel stood at the edge of town, just off the main highway. From the outside, it looked like something you'd expect to see in a movie, an old 3-story building with a worn sign that read, Crescent Hotel. The windows were dim, the parking lot nearly empty, but it looked like it had been around for decades. There was something about it that seemed out of place, but after hours of driving, I didn't care. I just needed a bed for the night. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The lobby was lit by a few dim lights, casting long shadows across the old wooden floors. There was a small desk with a bell, but no one was at the counter. I rang it twice, and after a few seconds, an older man appeared from behind a door. "Hello there," he said in a low, almost raspy voice. "Looking for a room?" I nodded. He didn't ask me for my ID or any of the usual information most hotels require. Instead, he handed me a key with a brass tag, number 204. Without a word, he gestured toward the staircase and disappeared back into the back room. I made my way upstairs to the second floor, the old wood creaking under my feet. The halls were lined with faded carpet, and the walls had an air of neglect, as if they hadn't been touched in years. I found room 204 at the end of the hall, and with a quiet turn of the key, I opened the door. Inside was a small, quaint room. The bed was covered in an old, floral-patterned comforter, and the wallpaper, though peeling in places, had a certain vintage charm. There was a single window, barely large enough to let in any light, and the room smelled faintly of mildew. But I wasn't picky, not at that point. It was quiet, and it was warm. I threw my bag on the bed and immediately set about unpacking my things. As I settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything overt, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air. It was as though the building itself had a life of its own, watching, waiting. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to being tired from the long drive. After a quick shower, I sat down in the armchair by the window and began to flip through some local brochures I had picked up earlier. It was around 9 o'clock when I heard the first sound, a soft, almost inaudible tapping coming from the walls. It was so faint that at first I thought it was the wind or maybe the old building settling. I tried to ignore it, but it persisted, growing louder as time passed. I stood up, walked over to the wall, and pressed my ear against it. It was silent now, but I could feel my heart rate quicken. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling in the room hadn't. The night wore on, and I tried my best to sleep, but I couldn't shake the odd feeling that clung to me. The wind howled outside, and the old building groaned as though it had a story to tell. But every time I thought I was drifting off, the sound of soft footsteps echoed down the hall. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. The dreams were strange and fragmented, like flashes of memories that didn't belong to me. A woman's voice, soft but demanding, echoed through my mind. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding in my chest, only to find the room exactly as I had left it. Still, the sense of unease lingered, and as I lay back down, I couldn't help but wonder what this hotel really was. I tried to push the thoughts aside and reminded myself that I had only a few hours to rest before continuing my journey. But I couldn't escape the feeling that this was no ordinary hotel. Something was wrong with the place, and I was about to find out exactly what it was. The morning came slowly, as though the hotel itself was trying to stretch out time. I woke up groggy, my body still heavy from the restless sleep. The sun was barely peeking through the small window when I swung my legs off the bed and stood up. My back cracked as I stretched, and I was thankful for the quiet of the room, as though it were waiting for me to adjust to the new day. I shuffled to the bathroom and splashed some cold water on my face, trying to shake off the remnants of the strange dreams I had. My reflection in the mirror seemed almost foreign, like I was looking at someone else. But I wasn't going to dwell on it. I had places to be, things to do, and I needed to get on the road. As I walked back into the room to grab my things, something caught my eye, something that hadn't been there the night before. The small chair by the window, which had been perfectly positioned earlier, was now tilted slightly to the left. It wasn't much, but it stood out in a way that made me pause. The chair was an old, heavy wooden piece that seemed too stubborn to move on its own. I couldn't remember having touched it since it arrived, yet there it was, shifted slightly as though someone had been sitting in it. I frowned, feeling that same unease from last night slowly creeping back into my chest. Maybe it's just the way the floorboards creak, I told myself, shrugging it off. I picked up my bag and walked to the door, ready to leave. But as my hand reached for the handle, I noticed something else, something even stranger. On the floor, just in front of the door, was a small object. At first glance, I thought it was just a misplaced piece of paper or a trash wrapper, But as I knelt to inspect it, I realized it was a single, small key. It wasn't a hotel key, nor did it resemble anything I'd seen before. It was old, the metal worn and scratched, the edges jagged. It had no label, no number, no identifying marks at all. Just a plain, unremarkable key. I sat back on my heels, staring at it. I had no idea where it had come from or who it belonged to. I hadn't seen it when I first entered the room, nor had I heard anything that could explain how it ended up here. For a moment, I considered taking it to the front desk and asking the man who'd checked me in. But something told me that wouldn't get me any answers. As I stood up, I glanced toward the bed, and that's when I noticed the strangest thing of all. There was a faint imprint in the blanket, right where I had been sleeping. It wasn't obvious at first, but when I looked closer, I could make out the distinct shape of a body. A person or something had been lying there while I slept. I couldn't explain it. I hadn't moved in my sleep, at least not that much. The pattern of the imprint suggested someone had been resting in that exact spot, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I glanced around the room, trying to make sense of it. The silence of the hotel was deafening, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. I grabbed the key, stuffed it in my pocket, and hurried to the door. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I had a feeling I wasn't alone. I walked downstairs, my steps echoing down the empty hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with each footstep. I approached the front desk and rang the bell again. It was only then that I realized the entire place felt deserted. There was no sign of the man who'd checked me in the night before, nor anyone else for that matter. The hotel seemed like it had been abandoned, frozen in time. After a few minutes of waiting, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting the old man to appear, but instead, it was a woman. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with dark eyes and a weary expression. She didn't seem surprised to see me, nor did she acknowledge the strange emptiness of the hotel. "Can I help you?" she asked in a soft, almost tired voice. I hesitated, wondering how much to say. I was just wondering if I could check out early. I didn't sleep too well last night." She nodded, as though it was nothing unusual. "Room 204, right?" I nodded. "Don't worry about it," she said. "We don't often get many guests here anyway. It's always like this, quiet." Her words hung in the air, adding to the growing tension in the pit of my stomach. I didn't feel reassured by her calm demeanor. If anything, it made things feel more surreal. "Sure, I'll get you checked out in a minute," she said, tapping something on the old-fashioned computer behind the desk. I didn't trust the way she spoke, as if she knew more about the place than she was letting on. As she processed the paperwork, I couldn't stop thinking about the imprint on the bed. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been in the room while I was asleep? Could it have been a mistake, or was it something more? I turned the key in my pocket, the jagged edges pressing against my palm, wondering if it had anything to do with whatever was going on in that room. I didn't want to be there anymore, but there was something pulling me back to the room, something I couldn't explain. My curiosity was getting the better of me. I needed to know what was really going on in that hotel. The days that followed were a strange blur. The feeling of unease in that hotel grew more pronounced with each passing hour. I'd come to expect the oddities, but they still caught me off guard every time. After checking out, I left the hotel behind, but the unsettling sensation didn't fade. It clung to me, following me through the town as I tried to move on. But something in my gut told me I needed answers. I couldn't just forget about what had happened, the strange imprint on the bed, the odd key, and the silence that seemed to hang over the hotel like a fog. I couldn't shake the thought that I had missed something crucial, something hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary. So I made a decision. I would go back. I needed to know what was going on. I returned that evening, and this time I didn't bother with the front desk. The hotel felt different at night. Quieter, yes, but also more ominous. The creak of the old wooden floors echoed in the hallways as I made my way to the same room I had stayed in before. Room 204. The door was closed, but it was the same as when I left. The air in the hallway was thick with a musty scent, the kind of smell you get in places that have been left to decay over time. I took a deep breath, trying to push past the tension that was building up in my chest. As I reached for the door handle, I noticed something odd. There was a faint scraping sound coming from inside the room. It wasn't loud, just a soft scratching, almost like fingernails dragging across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding. The noise stopped as soon as I placed my hand on the handle, but the fear was already there, crawling under my skin. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was empty. It looked just as it had when I left, with nothing out of place. But that didn't make sense. I could still hear the faint scratching noise in my head, echoing in my ears. It wasn't gone. It was still there, like a lingering presence. I stepped inside cautiously, my senses on high alert. The temperature seemed to drop as soon as I crossed the threshold. It wasn't a drastic change, but the chill in the air made my breath visible, puffing out in small clouds as I exhaled. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones, making you shiver even when you're standing still. I walked toward the bed, inspecting it closely. There were no new imprints this time, no signs that anyone had been there since it left. But something else caught my attention. The curtains, which had been pulled open when I left, were now drawn shut. I could feel my heart rate quickening as I stepped closer to the window. The moment I touched the fabric, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the room. I gasped, stumbling backward as the curtains flew open with a force that left me breathless. The room felt as though it was alive, as though something was breathing in the space around me. I couldn't stay there any longer. I rushed back toward the door, but before I could open it, I felt it, a sudden pressure in the air, like something was pushing against me from all sides. The floor beneath my feet seemed to tilt, and I had to catch myself to avoid falling. The walls appeared to close in around me, the room feeling smaller and smaller with every second. I slammed my hand against the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't open. Panic surged through me as I tugged at the handle again and again. The door was stuck, locked from the other side. I didn't understand. I hadn't touched the lock. I hadn't done anything to prevent it from opening. I turned around, looking for something, anything that could explain what was happening. That's when I saw it. On the opposite wall, a dark stain had begun to spread across the wallpaper, like ink bleeding through paper. It started small, but it was growing quickly, moving in erratic patterns. The room felt suffocating, like it was pressing in on me, and the longer I stood there, the more disoriented I became. I could feel the weight of the air around me, thick and oppressive. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the stain on the wall growing larger. Suddenly, the door behind me opened with a loud creak, as though it had been released from some unseen force. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the room and down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold air rushing into my lungs as I gasped for breath. I stumbled out into the parking lot, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of life. But the hotel was as empty as it had been when I first arrived. No one was around. The town felt deserted, as though it had been abandoned long ago. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to ask for help or how to explain what had happened. I could feel my body shaking, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. But there was no signal, no connection to the outside world. The screen on my phone was blank, as though the device itself had been swallowed up by the hotel's strange power. The night stretched on, and I was left alone in the cold, unsure of what I had just experienced. I kept thinking about the key I'd found in the room, the one that seemed so out of place. I hadn't heard anything about it since I left, and no one had ever explained its significance. But I knew, deep down, that it was tied to whatever was happening in that hotel. The strange events were becoming more frequent now. I could feel it in the air, a heavy, palpable presence that made it impossible to ignore. The hotel wasn't just a place, it was something else entirely. something alive. And I knew that I had to go back. I couldn't ignore the pull of the hotel any longer. Every day since I left, I kept thinking about it, about the strange feeling that had taken over me, about the things I had experienced that I couldn't quite explain. The restless nights, the pressure in the air, and the inexplicable forces that seemed to manipulate the world around me. I knew something dark was happening, and I couldn't walk away without knowing the truth. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a compulsion. I returned to the hotel on the same night that I had left, though I could feel the weight of something different in the air now. It wasn't just a creepy, old building. There was something far more sinister at work here, something ancient, something that had been waiting, lurking, for the right moment to strike. This time, I was prepared, or so I thought. Armed with nothing but my determination and an overwhelming sense of dread, I approached the front door once more. The bell above it jingled lightly as I stepped inside. The hotel lobby was empty again, the silence pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. Even the old man behind the desk was gone, leaving the lobby eerily vacant. I didn't hesitate. I headed straight for the stairs, the same stairs that had creaked under my weight on the way up, the ones that felt far too old and unstable for comfort. They seemed to groan even louder now as I ascended, as though protest my presence. The air grew colder as I neared the second floor, and the feeling of being watched crept up my spine. I could hear something, faint footsteps echoing behind me, yet there was no one else around. My heart raced, but I forced myself to continue forward, determined to reach room 204 again, to uncover what had happened. When I reached the door, it was ajar, just like before. The room sat in perfect stillness, but it felt different this time. There was a tangible sense of something waiting, something anticipating my arrival. The coldness in the air had deepened, the kind of cold you feel when you're standing in a tomb, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel like you're suffocating from the inside out. I stepped into the room cautiously, my shoes barely making a sound on the worn carpet. The faintest scraping noise came from the far corner, where the old chair sat, still rocking ever so slightly. The low hum of the refrigerator in the corner seemed unnaturally loud, and the air was so thick I could almost taste it. Then I saw it, the mark. The stain on the wall, the one that had been so faint before, was now unmistakable. It had spread like ink blotting across paper, swirling in intricate patterns, dark and ominous. It was as though it was alive, pulsing in rhythm with my heart. And then, in a split second, it moved. I froze. My entire body went rigid, and I couldn't breathe. The mark on the wall began to shift, the ink-like stain crawling upward, twisting in unnatural shapes. There was no way I could make sense of it, no explanation that could possibly account for what I was seeing. The temperature plummeted. I could feel the air biting at my skin, my teeth chattering in response. My breath came out in visible puffs, thick and heavy, but even that was drowned out by the sound that came next. A low growl. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a human. It was a guttural, otherworldly sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the hotel, shaking the floor beneath my feet. I felt it in my chest, like a vibration deep within me, like something alive was speaking directly to my bones. My legs were shaking as I backed away from the wall, but no matter how far I stepped back, I couldn't escape the sound. It grew louder. The stain on the wall stretched out into a grotesque shape, pulling itself from the surface like tendrils reaching out to grab me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, panic rising in my chest, but the door wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in on me. The very walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with pressure, pushing in on me from all sides. The growl intensified, now joined by an eerie, high-pitched wail that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, constricted, as though I was suffocating under the weight of the room itself. I wasn't alone anymore. There was something in the room with me, and it was closing in. I frantically tugged at the door, my hands slick with sweat, but the door refused to open. It felt as though something was holding it shut, something far stronger than any human hand could manage. I turned back toward the wall, my gaze locking onto the growing stain that now spread across the entire surface. It was reaching toward me, its tendrils stretching out like fingers, like claws, ready to tear me apart. My mind raced. What was it? What had I stumbled into? Then the voice came. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A whisper, as cold as ice, brushing against my ear like a chilling breeze. You shouldn't have come back. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't even a voice I could describe. It was something far older, something that existed in the shadows, in places beyond time and space. It was something that had been waiting for me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt paralyzed, trapped in that moment, trapped by whatever force had claimed this place. The growling intensified, now joined by the unmistakable sound of claws dragging across the floor, scraping against the carpet as they approached me. I finally found my voice. It was weak, shaking, but it broke through the noise, the horror. What do you want? The whispering voice responded, softer now, more insistent. You're not supposed to be here. The room seemed to spin. My vision blurred, and I could feel the very air around me growing heavier, suffocating me with its weight. I was going to die here. I knew it, and no one would ever know. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The growling faded, and the air grew still again, unnaturally still. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, and I realized I was standing in the middle of the room, trembling. It was gone. I didn't wait to see what else might happen. I couldn't. I lunged for the door again, and this time it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. But as I ran, my mind couldn't shake one terrifying thought. Whatever that thing was, whatever that force was, it was still here. It hadn't left. It was still waiting. And the hotel? It wasn't just a building. It was something much, much worse. The tension from that night lingered like a fog, thick and suffocating, even as I fled the hotel in a panic. My feet were numb from running, my heart a constant drumbeat in my chest. I didn't dare look back, not even once, for fear of seeing something, anything, that might confirm what I already knew deep down. The hotel was no longer a place of business or hospitality. It was a vessel of torment, a prison for those who ventured too far into its dark corners. As I stumbled down the street, I could feel the weight of the oppressive atmosphere lifting just slightly, but the sensation of being watched never quite left me. I had escaped the hotel, but had I really escaped the horrors it harbored? The unease that clawed at my insides didn't go away. It followed me, just out of reach, waiting for me to slip up. I didn't go home right away. I couldn't. Not with everything I had seen. I didn't know where else to go, so I checked into a small, quiet motel on the outskirts of town. The room was plain, bare even, but it was safe, far safer than the cursed walls of that hotel at least. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and sank into the bed, exhausted from the terror I had just lived through. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay there for what felt like hours, tossing and turning, my mind racing through the events of the night. The stain on the wall, the growling, the whispering voice. I still couldn't make sense of it. Nothing about what I had experienced fit within the boundaries of logic or reason. No rational explanation could account for the feeling of the walls closing in on me, the pressure in the air, the sense that something ancient and malevolent was waiting just beyond the veil. I tried to push it all out of my mind. I focused on the mundane things, the creak of the bed frame, the hum of the motel's refrigerator. But it didn't work. My thoughts kept drifting back to the hotel, back to the room where I had felt that cold, suffocating presence. Why had I gone back? What had possessed me to return to that place? And more importantly, what was it that I had encountered? It wasn't just some old hotel with a haunted reputation. It was something far darker. Something that could never be explained in the daylight. I knew one thing for sure. The hotel wasn't done with me. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the fear of what I had seen. It was the realization that whatever dark force resided in that hotel was no longer bound to its walls. I could feel it, like a shadow creeping just behind me. I wasn't free. I wasn't safe. It was waiting for me to return, to finish what had started. The next morning, I called the local authorities. I didn't know what else to do. Maybe they could shed some light on the bizarre happenings at the hotel. Maybe they could explain the strange markings, the unnatural cold, the eerie whispers. But when I arrived at the hotel with an officer, I found nothing. The building was empty. The air was stale, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The stain on the wall? Gone. The chair that had rocked on its own? Just an ordinary, dusty old chair now. It was as if everything that had terrified me the night before had never existed at all. I was told that the hotel had been abandoned for years. No one had stayed there for as long as anyone could remember. The officer dismissed the whole thing as an overactive imagination. After all, I had been in a place known for its unsettling atmosphere, and I was probably just scared by the building's age and decay. But I knew the truth. I had seen what no one else had. And no matter how much I wanted to believe it was just a bad dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was hiding something far darker than anyone realized. I left that day, knowing I had no real answers, no resolution to the nightmare that had unfolded. The hotel stayed in the back of my mind, gnawing at me like a puzzle with missing pieces. I could never forget what I had experienced there, the suffocating dread, the sense that I had stumbled into something I wasn't meant to understand. Days passed, then weeks, but the hotel stayed with me. I couldn't let it go, and it couldn't let me go. I began researching the building, trying to find any history or rumors that might explain what had happened. The town's old records were sparse, but I eventually found something chilling. The hotel had been built on land that had once been the site of a series of brutal, unexplained deaths. The original owners had vanished mysteriously, and the hotel had sat abandoned for years after that. The town, though reluctant to talk about it, had long been aware of the hotel's strange reputation, with many locals claiming it was cursed. But no one had ever confirmed anything. No one had ever gone inside long enough to uncover the truth. As I pieced together the fragments of information, I realized something. There was no escaping it. The hotel wasn't just haunted. It was a gateway, a bridge to something far darker than I had ever imagined. It wasn't the building itself that was cursed. It was what had been bound within it. I couldn't walk away from this. Not with this knowledge. I had been marked. The hotel had seen me. It had touched me. And now I was a part of it. I couldn't stop thinking about the stain on the wall, the growling, the whispers. I could feel them creeping into my mind, like a constant presence in the back of my thoughts. The only question that remained was how long I had before the hotel came for me again. But there was one thing I knew for certain. I wasn't the last person to have stayed in that hotel. And whatever had happened to them, whatever they had experienced, wasn't over. Not yet. As I sat in the silence of my room, I realized that the only resolution I would ever find was knowing that I had made it out, just barely. But as for the hotel, its dark history, its malevolent force, that was something I could never forget. And that was the real horror, knowing that I could never truly escape. Because something had been awakened inside me that night, something that would follow me, just as it had followed every soul before me who dared to enter. The days that followed felt like a blur, half forgotten, distorted by the heavy weight of dread that still clung to me. The hotel, or whatever force had inhabited it, stayed in my thoughts, lurking in the background of my every waking moment. It wasn't just the memories of that night, but the awareness that something I couldn't explain had forever altered my perception of reality. It wasn't just the terror. It was the unsettling thought that perhaps, in some way, I was tied to that place now. That the experiences it had were not merely a fluke of coincidence, but an invitation into something much darker, something I would never be able to fully understand. As much as I tried to put it all behind me, The idea that something had been awakened in me that night kept me up at odd hours, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't make sense of. I kept researching, hoping to find some sort of resolution, some answer that could explain what had happened. But the more I delved into the history of the hotel, the more I realized how futile it was. Every piece of information I uncovered led only to more questions. The town kept its secrets well guarded, and the people who lived there were either too frightened to speak or had long since forgotten the horrors of the past. The hotel was cursed, yes, but what was the source of the curse? What was the darkness that had attached itself to the place? No one seemed to know. As time wore on, I tried to push the hotel from my mind, to continue with my life as best as I could. I moved to a new city, started a new job, and surrounded myself with people who had no idea what I had been through. For a while, I felt like I could breathe again. I even managed to sleep without the constant gnawing fear that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. But there were nights, quiet, sleepless nights, when the memories would return. I'd find myself awake at 2 a.m., unable to shake the feeling of that cold air in the hotel room, the sounds of the whispers and the growling. It was as if they never left me, as though the hotel's grip on me had only been momentarily loosened, waiting for the right time to tighten again. One particular evening, months after I thought I had put it all behind me, something happened that brought it all rushing back. It was a typical night, or so it seemed, quiet, no different than any other. But as I sat in my living room, a knock on the door broke the silence. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated for a moment before opening it. When I did, I froze. Standing in front of me was a man, nondescript in appearance, but there was something unsettling about him, something familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but as he spoke, the air in the room seemed to thicken. "I need to talk to you about the hotel," he said, his voice low and quiet, but piercing. The moment he spoke, a chill ran through me. It was as if the room suddenly dropped several degrees. My throat tightened, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But no, there he was, standing in front of me. The memory of the hotel, of the fear, flooded back like a tidal wave. How did you know?" I stammered, my words failing to come out right. I wasn't prepared for this. He glanced around, then stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his movements smooth but deliberate. He didn't look threatening, yet I instinctively felt that something about him was off. "I know what happened to you," he said, his voice strangely comforting, but with an undercurrent of something darker. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. How could he possibly know? How could anyone? "I was there too," he continued, as though reading my thoughts. "I stayed at the hotel before you did. I saw it. I felt it." His eyes met mine, and there was something in them, something that reflected a shared understanding. It was as though he too had crossed the same line I had, stepped into the same world of dread, of forces beyond our comprehension. "I've been trying to find you," he said, "because there's something you need to understand. The hotel, it doesn't just let go. Once it chooses you, it doesn't ever really release you. Not completely." The room felt colder now, the shadows in the corners of the walls stretching unnaturally long. My heart began to race again, and I instinctively backed away from him. "You're not the first one to escape," he added, his voice growing more urgent. "But most people never get far. They think they've outrun it, but it's always there, waiting. It follows you, even if you can't see it." I didn't want to hear any more, but I couldn't stop myself from listening. I felt paralyzed, caught in a strange blend of fear and fascination. "Who are you?" I finally managed to choke out. "What do you want from me?" He shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. "I'm here to warn you, to help you." He explained that he had spent years after his encounter with the hotel trying to find others like me, others who had experienced the same things, who had felt the pull of the darkness that lived there. He had learned over time that there was no escaping it, not truly. Even if you ran, even if you hid, the hotel would eventually find you again. "You're never free of it," he said, his eyes dark with the weight of his words. It's inside you now. The words sank in, and for the first time since that night, I felt a heavy, crushing certainty. The hotel had become a part of me. The terror, the darkness, it was all woven into my being now. There was no running from it, no matter how far I went. It would find me. It always did. I worked at a hospital, not just any hospital, but an old one on the edge of town. This building had been standing for over a century, serving as a sanctuary for those who needed care. The place had a history, sure, but nothing that stood out to me at first. When you work somewhere every day, you get used to its quirks. The long hallways, the smell of antiseptic, the faint hum of machines and lights. All of it felt perfectly ordinary. Or at least, it did until things started happening. I was part of the night shift team, mainly tasked with handling emergencies, making rounds, and ensuring the patients were comfortable. It was a regular job. I wasn't a nurse or a doctor, but I had spent enough time in the hospital to know the routine. The sounds of footsteps echoing down the hall, the rattling of trays, and the occasional beeping of a monitor. These things were as much a part of the environment as the walls themselves. There were a few staff members I worked with regularly. David, a tall, quiet guy who had been at the hospital for years, and Rebecca, who had just joined. We spent long nights together, getting to know each other over cups of coffee, and, as you'd expect in any workplace, sharing the odd story now and then. Nothing too unusual. But then, things started to change. It wasn't immediately noticeable, just little things at first. One evening, I was making my usual rounds on the lower floor of the hospital. It's funny how even in a place so busy, the hallways can feel eerily empty at night. The quietness would often remind me of something missing, but I never thought much of it. The flickering lights above and the shadows cast by the old furniture only made it feel like something was always watching, but still, I shrugged it off. Everyone else did, too. The hospital was old, after all. David and I would occasionally chat while checking on rooms, and that night was no different. We exchanged pleasantries, joked about how slow the night had been, and went on our way. Rebecca, though, was often quieter. She had only been there a few weeks, but she seemed on edge, almost like she was expecting something to happen. At first, I thought it was just her being new to the job. But when she started asking questions, I began to wonder. "Hey, have you guys heard about the rumors?" she asked one night. She was standing by the nurse's station, fidgeting with the edge of her uniform. Her face was pale, her eyes darting around as if something was off. "What rumors?" I had replied, not looking up from the clipboard I was holding. "You know," she said, lowering her voice. "The ones about the lower floors. People say things happen down there." I had laughed it off. "It's an old building, Rebecca. I'm sure people just talk. Besides, nothing's ever happened when I've been here." David, who had been listening quietly, chimed in. "It's just stories. People talk about haunted places, but it's just the building settling. I wouldn't worry about it." Rebecca nodded, but didn't look convinced. I remember feeling a little uneasy about her reaction. It was as though something had changed in her since that conversation. Over the next few days, she seemed to withdraw even more. She would keep to herself, avoid certain areas, and frequently glance over her shoulder. Something had spooked her, and it made me uncomfortable, too. It wasn't long before the hospital started showing signs of its age, not just in the physical structure, but in the atmosphere itself. One night, as I walked through the hallways, I noticed the distinct smell of something burning. At first, I thought it might be a malfunctioning piece of equipment, but when I checked the rooms, nothing was out of place. The smell lingered for hours, and yet no one else seemed to notice. The temperature also seemed to fluctuate. One room would be freezing cold, while the next would be sweltering. These little inconsistencies seemed small at first, but they started to build up, creating a nagging feeling at the back of my mind. And then there was the sound. It started faintly, like a tapping or scratching sound coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or the ventilation system acting up, but the noise didn't stop. It got louder, more distinct. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., I would hear it, the tapping, sharp and rhythmic, echoing through the hall. I tried to dismiss it as the building settling, but it wasn't the same sound. It was deliberate, almost as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. I remember the first time it happened while I was alone in the hallway. It just finished checking on the patients in the lower floors, and the hallway felt unusually cold. The tapping echoed from the walls. I froze, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as though the sound was following me, shifting from one spot to another. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the noise was too clear to ignore. When I finally reached the nurse's station, I saw Rebecca standing there, her back to me. She looked even more drained than usual, her face pale, her eyes wide and distant. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Rebecca had been hearing the tapping too. In fact, she said it had started to follow her too, ever since she started working the night shift. She said it felt like someone was watching, but when she turned around, there was no one there. David hadn't mentioned anything about hearing the noises, but I saw the change in him too. He'd begun to avoid certain areas of the hospital, particularly the lower floors. He'd become jumpy, glancing over his shoulder as if someone were always behind him. We didn't talk about it out loud, but we all knew something wasn't right. It wasn't until later that I realized how much I had started to feel the same way. Every creak of the floorboards, every sudden draft, every flicker of light seemed to have a hidden meaning, something unsettling beneath the surface. The hospital had become a place where the mundane and the terrifying coexisted, and it was only a matter of time before the unsettling feelings turned into something much worse. I can't explain what exactly happened that night, but I can tell you that the feeling of dread settled over the hospital like a thick fog. We were no longer just working, we were surviving. The night I realized things weren't quite as normal as they seemed was when I first heard the footsteps. It wasn't the typical sounds you'll hear in a hospital, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the soft footsteps of patients trying to get out of bed, or the brisk pace of doctors rushing by. This was different. I was on my usual rounds, moving quietly through the halls. The lower floors, as I mentioned before, were old, dimly lit, and mostly unused after hours. It was always dead quiet at night. But that night, as I walked toward the emergency exit, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. It was subtle at first, almost like a soft shuffle on the floor, not quite right. The pace didn't match mine, too fast for someone walking in a hospital, but not quick enough for someone running. I paused for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another nurse on the rounds. But when I looked back, no one was there. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart beginning to race. I called out, "David? Rebecca?" But there was nothing but silence in return. The feeling in my chest tightened, and a cold chill settled in. I forced myself to shake it off, convinced it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe it was the stress of the long hours, maybe the isolation. Hospitals can feel like strange places at night, especially in the older sections, but something about this felt off. As I turned to continue my walk down the hall, I heard it again, closer this time. The distinct sound of footsteps, deliberate and steady. I snapped my head back, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but again, there was nothing. The hallway stretched out behind me, long and empty, only illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lights. At that moment, I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't alone, I was sure of it. But who? And why was there no one else around? It didn't make sense. I walked faster, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I could feel my breath quicken, my mind racing, and yet I tried to remain calm. When I reached the nurse's station, I saw Rebecca standing by the desk, her back turned. She was fiddling with her phone, lost in thought. "Hey," I said, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "Did you hear that? Footsteps?" Rebecca stiffened and turned around slowly, her eyes wide. She looked more exhausted than usual, her eyes bloodshot, almost like she hadn't been sleeping well. She didn't respond right away, and when she did, it was in a quiet, almost hesitant tone. "I've been hearing things," she murmured, glancing down the darkened hallway. I thought it was just me. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What things?" Rebecca hesitated again, looking at me like she wasn't sure whether she should say it aloud. But after a moment, she whispered, "I've been hearing footsteps. They follow me sometimes, late at night." I thought I was just imagining it. I stared at her, my mind spinning. The very thing I had just heard, footsteps following me, was exactly what she had been hearing. But I couldn't bring myself to ask if she thought it was something more. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but something about her tone made it clear that she wasn't just imagining things. David had been standing quietly near the vending machine at the end of the hall. I hadn't noticed him at first, but when I glanced over, I saw him watching us. His face was pale, and there was something about the way he stood there, rigid, almost tense, that made my stomach drop. "David," I called out, trying to sound normal. "You hear anything unusual lately?" David didn't answer right away. He shifted uncomfortably before walking over to us. His eyes darted to the hallway and then back to Rebecca and me, as though checking to see if anyone else was nearby. "Don't go down the east wing alone," he said abruptly, his voice low and strained. Rebecca and I exchanged a confused glance. "What do you mean?" I asked. David shook his head, his expression darkening. "It's not safe. I've been hearing things too. And trust me, it's not just the old building settling. I don't know what it is, but something's off." The atmosphere in the hallway grew tense. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A shiver ran down my spine. I had always prided myself on staying level-headed, but something about the way David said those words felt so final, so serious, that I couldn't ignore it. "Is this some kind of joke?" Rebecca asked, her voice shaking slightly. But David's serious expression made it clear that this wasn't a joke. Something had changed, and whatever it wasn't good. We spent the next few minutes discussing the strange events that had been happening around the hospital. David mentioned hearing strange noises coming from the east wing, particularly in the late hours. The rattling of doors, the echo of footsteps, whispers in the dark. At first, I thought it was just old plumbing or wind, but the more he spoke, the more I realized how consistent his experiences were with what I had been feeling. Rebecca and I shared stories of the noises, of how the building seemed to shift on its own, of how the atmosphere grew thicker the deeper into the hospital you went. And just like that, the tension in the air seemed to multiply. We were no longer just talking about coincidences, we were talking about something we couldn't explain. The conversation didn't help ease my mind. If anything, it only made the fear more palpable. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The hospital, which had once felt like a second home, now seemed like a place of unease and growing dread. The hallways stretched on forever, each corner holding a new mystery, each door possibly hiding something we weren't ready to face. But it was just the beginning. The next incident would prove that something more than just footsteps was moving in the dark. It didn't take long before the strange events became more frequent, more impossible to ignore. Each night, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the hospital transformed. The usual hum of machinery and the soft clatter of nurses' footsteps were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the unmistakable sounds of footsteps. Rebecca, David, and I could no longer pretend we were imagining things. The footsteps weren't the only strange occurrences we started noticing. Each night, something new would happen. Doors creaked open when no one was around, lights flickered erratically, and objects in the hallways, things that shouldn't have moved, seemed to shift positions. It was as if the very building itself was alive, pulsating with a kind of energy we couldn't explain. And it felt like we were slowly losing control of the situation. I knelt to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed, as if it had been there for years. It was blank, except for one word, scrawled in what looked like blood. Leave! I felt my heart skip a beat. My eyes darted around, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but there was no one. The hallway was still as ever, but the chill in the air made it feel like I was standing in the middle of a cold, deserted wasteland. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what I'd just seen. Maybe it was a prank, maybe someone else had left it there. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in this hospital wasn't just strange, it was something more sinister. The next day, when I came back to work, I found that I wasn't the only one on edge. Rebecca was pale, her hands shaking as she handed me a report. Her eyes were wide, and she was looking over her shoulder as though she was expecting something or someone to appear from the shadows. The same wing David had warned us about. The East Wing, the area that had been shut off for years. The rooms there had been closed off long before I started working at the hospital. The walls were worn and cracked, and the floors creaked as though they were decades old. No one ever went down there. No one except the occasional janitor who had the misfortune of needing to get supplies. Rebecca's fear was contagious, and I could feel my own anxiety building. That night, David came in with the same sense of urgency. His eyes were wide, and there was a tension in his posture, as though he was bracing himself for something terrible to happen. "I know you've been hearing things," David said to us, voice low and filled with dread. "I've been hearing them too. But I also found something. I think we need to check it out." "What did you find?" I asked, already knowing he wasn't going to say anything reassuring. David looked around, checking to see if anyone was nearby before he leaned in closer. "I found a journal. It was hidden in one of the old supply rooms in the East Wing." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The East Wing? It was forbidden territory, a place we had been warned to avoid. But David had gone there. And now he had found something. "I think we should go down there," he said. "Tonight. We need to know what's going on." Rebecca and I exchanged nervous glances, but I could feel the fear growing inside me. We couldn't just let this go. Something was happening, and it wasn't just going to go away on its own. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie orange glow through the windows, we made our way down the long corridor to the East Wing. The hallways felt different as we moved deeper into the building. The air seemed colder, thicker, almost as though we were moving through a different dimension. The smell of mildew and dust clung to the walls, and the flickering lights above only added to the sense of unease. David led the way, his footsteps heavy against the old, creaking floorboards. Rebecca followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the shadows. I was last, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the darkness. We reached the supply room, the door creaking open with a groan as David pushed it aside. Inside, the room was filled with old boxes and medical supplies that hadn't been touched in years. But there, in the back corner, was a small wooden box, half hidden beneath a pile of forgotten sheets. David knelt down and opened the box, revealing a worn, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. He carefully opened it, scanning the pages. "There's something strange in here," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "It talks about experiments, about things they were doing here, things they shouldn't have been doing." A shiver ran through my spine as the words sank in. We weren't dealing with some forgotten piece of history. We were dealing with something much darker, something still lingering within the walls of this place. And then, as if on cue, the lights above us flickered and went out. The lights went out with a sickening flicker, plunging us into darkness. The air turned unnervingly still, thick with the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making you wonder if you're alone. I felt my heart race, my chest tightening as I looked around, my eyes struggling to adjust to the blackness that surrounded us. The faint smell of dust lingered in the air, but now it was overpowered by the unmistakable scent of decay, an odor I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the mustiness of an old hospital. This was something worse, something foul, like the air in a room that had been sealed off for years. I reached for the flashlight in my pocket, my hand trembling as I fumbled for the button. The beam of light pierced the darkness, sweeping across the walls, illuminating the piles of old medical supplies. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the shadows dancing against the walls, flickering in sync with the light from my flashlight. But there was no one else in the room. "I don't like this," Rebecca's voice whispered from behind me, her tone tense, fearful. "Let's go. Whatever this is, it's too much." But David didn't answer. He was standing near the far end of the room, his face pale, his body rigid as though he had seen something that had stopped him in his tracks. His hand was outstretched, pointing at something across the room, his face frozen in a mask of terror. David didn't respond at first. He just stared at the spot, his eyes wide, unblinking, as though he couldn't tear his gaze away from whatever was there. I followed the direction of his finger, my heart pounding in my chest, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by shadows, was something or someone. A figure, hunched over, its back to us. It was too still, too silent. At first, I thought it might just be a trick of the light, an old mannequin, or some forgotten piece of medical equipment. But as my flashlight swept over the figure, my blood ran cold. It was a person with unnaturally pale, almost ashen skin, and a disfigured face that seemed to be frozen in a permanent expression of agony. Its hands were gnarled and thin, fingers twisted at odd angles as if they'd been broken and reset over and over. And its eyes were hollow, dark pits, empty and devoid of life. But somehow I could feel them staring at me. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on me. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath mist in the air, and a cold wave of fear washed over me, leaving my skin prickling with terror. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was impossible to look at, but I couldn't look away. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. David, shaking, finally spoke, his voice hoarse and trembling. That's the patient from the journal, the one they never let out." Rebecca's breath hitched behind me, and I could feel her hands gripping my shoulders, her panic rising in waves. "We need to get out of here," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "Now." But before any of us could move, the figure turned. Slowly. Its neck cracked in an unnatural way, the bones popping as its head shifted, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. I felt my heart stop, a wave of pure terror washing over me. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking beneath me, and I wasn't sure if I was going to fall or if I was about to run. The figure's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, exposing rows of yellow, rotting teeth. And then it began to move. It was slow at first, its limbs jerking in a series of spasms, as though it was fighting against some unseen force. But then it moved with startling speed, lunging forward, its hand outstretched toward me, its nails scraping the floor with an unnatural screech. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, as though it had been paralyzed by the very presence of the thing in front of me. I could hear Rebecca screaming behind me, but it was distant, as though I were submerged underwater. All I could see, all I could hear, was the figure's approach. We burst into the hallway, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights flickered back to life, casting a dim, sickly glow across the walls. But I didn't care about the lights. I didn't care about anything except the feeling of the thing's eyes still on me, still burrowing into my soul. We didn't stop running until we reached the main entrance of the hospital, the heavy doors slamming shut behind us. We were outside in the cold night air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still inside, waiting for us, watching. David was the first to speak, his voice trembling with fear. We need to burn this place down. It's the only way." Rebecca's hands were shaking as she clutched her coat tightly around her. "But what about the others? What if there's more of them?" We stood in front of the hospital, the cold night air cutting through the tension that gripped us. The adrenaline that had carried us to the door was beginning to fade, and in its place, there was nothing but fear. A fear that didn't just cling to my skin, but had burrowed into my bones. None of us spoke as we stared at the looming, decaying structure in front of us. The hospital had once been a place of healing, but now it was a place of death, a place where something unnatural had taken root. David was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just walk away from this. We can't leave that thing in there. It's still alive. Whatever it is, it's still there." Rebecca, who had been hugging her arms tightly against her chest, shook her head in disbelief. "But what are we supposed to do? We barely escaped with our lives. How are we supposed to fight that thing?" I could hear the raw edge of panic in her voice, and I couldn't blame her. We had just faced something I couldn't even begin to understand. But deep down, I knew she was right. Running away might have been our only option. We were out of our depth. "We can't leave it," David repeated, his voice growing firmer, more determined. "We have to burn it down. We have to end this before it spreads." I glanced back at the building, its windows dark and lifeless, the doors that had once seemed like a way out now appearing to be the entrance to something much darker. My stomach churned with a mixture of dread and guilt. The thought of going back inside that place, of confronting whatever horrors waited in the shadows, felt like an impossible choice. But the truth was, there was no other way. "You're right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We can't leave it to hurt anyone else, but we can't go in there unprepared. We need a plan." Rebecca nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but also a glimmer of resolve. "Okay, what's the plan?" David's eyes were sharp, calculating, as he looked over the hospital. "Well, burn it down, but we can't just torch the building. We need to make sure we destroy whatever is inside. We need to go back in, find the source of this thing, and make sure it's gone. Then we'll burn it." The words felt surreal, like something I had heard in a horror movie, but there was no turning back now. We had seen what was inside that building. We had witnessed something that shouldn't have existed, something that defied logic. And it was up to us to make sure it didn't escape into the world. The three of us stood in the parking lot, planning our next move in shaky, whispered voices. We all knew the gravity of what we were about to do, but none of us had any illusions that we were prepared for it. We were no experts in exorcisms or ghost hunting, just regular people who had stumbled into something much darker than we could have imagined. David was already setting up the fuel, his hands moving methodically as he poured gasoline along the perimeter of the building. I couldn't help but notice how his hands trembled, how his eyes kept darting to the hospital doors, as though he expected something to emerge from the darkness. He had become more focused, determined, but I could see that the fear was still there, bubbling just beneath the surface. "We need to move fast," David said, snapping me out of my thoughts. "If we're going in, we need to get what we need and get out." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The plan was simple, almost too simple for what we were about to face, but there was no other choice. We had to go back inside. The moment we stepped back into the hospital, the air felt different. It was heavier, charged with an energy that made every step feel like it was being watched. The dim light from the flashlight I was carrying illuminated the walls in sickly yellow, casting long, distorted shadows. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the smell of rot stronger than before. It was as if the building itself had come alive, reacting to our presence. "We need to find it," I muttered, my voice trembling slightly, "and destroy whatever's left." David's eyes were scanning the dark corners of the hallway, his every movement tense. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. What if it had followed us? What if it was waiting for us? We moved quickly, taking a route that would bring us close to the central area of the building, where we had encountered the figure earlier. As we approached the hallway that led to the old patient rooms, the temperature dropped, a chill that sank deep into our bones. It wasn't the cold of the night air. It was something more sinister, something unnatural. Rebecca stopped suddenly, her face paling as she glanced down the corridor. "It's here," she whispered, barely audible. I felt my stomach drop. The air grew thicker, the silence pressing in on me. And then I saw it. The figure. It was standing at the far end of the hallway, facing us, just as it had before. It hadn't moved, hadn't advanced, but I could feel its eyes locked on us, that same hollow gaze piercing through the darkness. I could feel it, just like I had before. But this time, it was different. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. It lunged at us, faster than I had ever thought possible. The fight for survival blurred into a series of desperate movements, frantic and chaotic. David was the first to react, swinging a metal pipe he had found in one of the abandoned rooms. The impact made a sickening sound, but the creature didn't stop. It recoiled, but it wasn't deterred. It was relentless. Rebecca screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me back toward the exit. We had to get out. There was no other option. David was still fighting it, holding his ground, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the realization that this thing wasn't going to be easy to stop. But it was a distraction, a desperate, final effort to slow it down. We ran. We didn't look back. Not until we were outside again, standing in front of the burning hospital, watching as the flames consumed the building. The flames rose higher, the heat licking at the air, as the structure began to crumble. We watched in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire as it engulfed the remnants of the place. But even then, standing there in the warmth of the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The building was burning, yes, but the shadow that had haunted us still lingered in the back of my mind. The creature, whatever it was gone, but the feeling of its presence still haunted me. David looked over at me, his face drawn, exhausted. "It's over," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It has to be." I didn't say anything. I couldn't, because deep down, I knew that whatever we had faced, whatever had been in that hospital, wasn't truly gone. The nights I spent sleepless, staring at the ceiling, wondering if what we had faced in that hospital was real, or just some twisted product of fear and stress. But deep down, I knew that what happened was something far darker than a mere nightmare. I knew it was something I couldn't explain, something that defied everything I thought I knew about reality. As the days turned into weeks, the memories of that place started to fade, at least on the surface. The images, the sounds, the darkness, it all became distant, like fragments of a dream. But every now and then, something would trigger it, a strange feeling, a sharp chill in the air, or a flicker of light in the corner of my eye. That's when it would all come rushing back. The cold, the shadows, the thing that had been waiting in the dark. I couldn't help but wonder if it was still out there, waiting. After all, we hadn't destroyed it. We had only burned the building, reduced the hospital to ashes, but we never saw the creature die. We never saw it truly vanish. And that uncertainty gnawed at me, making me uneasy at the most unexpected times. I found myself glancing over my shoulder when walking down the street, or checking every corner of a room before entering. but it never fully left me. It was when I decided to return to the town that the real horror began to sink in. I wasn't sure what drove me to go back. Maybe it was the nagging need for closure, or maybe it was the fact that I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. I didn't tell anyone, David or Rebecca, or even think about reaching out to them. It was something I had to do on my own. So, without any warning, I found myself standing on the outskirts of the town, staring at the barren plot of land where the hospital once stood. To my surprise, there was nothing there. No remains of the building. The land was vacant, completely empty, as if the hospital had never existed in the first place. My heart sank, the realization hitting me hard. The place had been erased. Not just physically, but somehow, it felt as though it had never been there at all. I walked closer, almost drawn to the spot where I knew the hospital had once stood, where the walls had been soaked in fear, where that thing had waited. My footsteps echoed in the silence, the air still and heavy around me. It was unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, as if on cue, I heard it. A low sound, distant but familiar. It was the groan. The same guttural noise I had heard before, the sound that had haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I froze. There was no mistaking it. It was back. The thing from the hospital, the creature that had chased us, that had driven us to the brink of madness. It was here, and somehow it had followed me. It had followed me all the way to this empty plot of land, this place where nothing was supposed to exist. I turned, my heart racing, but I saw nothing. The land was still empty, the wind picking up just enough to stir the air. The sound echoed again, louder this time, closer. I had no idea what to do. Running had never seemed like a real option. Every time we tried to escape, it followed. It found us. We couldn't hide. But here, with nothing but an empty field stretching out before me, I realized something. It didn't matter where I went. It didn't matter how far I ran. The creature would always be there, just out of sight, lurking in the darkness of my mind. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Was this all in my head? Had the terror of that night somehow warped my sense of reality? Or had the thing actually followed me, haunted me, made sure that it never left? Before I could gather my thoughts, I heard the sound again, closer, clearer. But this time, I felt it too. The temperature dropped, the air growing heavy with the same oppressive presence I had felt in the hospital. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the shadow of something moved in the corner of my vision. It was standing there, just beyond the empty plot, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted in place, my body frozen in fear. But when I finally managed to take a step back, when I forced myself to break the trance, the world seemed to shift. The hospital had vanished, and yet the creature remained. It was no longer confined to the walls of that decaying building. It had followed me, infiltrated my world, making its presence felt wherever I went. I don't know what the creature was. I don't know if it was truly a spirit, a ghost, or something much worse. What I do know is that it was real. It was as real as the ground beneath my feet, as real as the beating of my heart. But the real horror wasn't just in the monster or the hospital. The real horror was in the fact that it wasn't over. It was never over. No matter how far we ran, no matter how much we tried to destroy it, we couldn't escape it. The thing had found its way into our lives, into our memories, and now there was no way to rid ourselves of it. I couldn't tell you if it'll ever be free from it. I can't tell you if anyone else who stepped foot in that hospital will ever find peace. But what I can tell you is this. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy the boundaries of reality, things that will always find a way to survive, to haunt us, no matter how much we try to forget.